I remember cramming into the rusted sedan with my three closest friends on that sweltering August afternoon in 2019 when I was 22 and convinced that courage could be summoned simply by pretending it existed. The vinyl seat stuck to our backs as we loaded camping gear into the trunk, and anticipation mixed with something heavier in the humid air. We had no concrete destination planned, we rarely did back then, which made every venture feel like we were tempting fate itself. Marcus slammed the driver's side door and cranked the engine, his usual cocksure grin already plastered across his face. At 23, he was the designated driver for most of our adventures, mainly because his car was the only one that could reliably make it more than 50 miles from town. Vanessa climbed into the passenger seat, adjusting the rearview mirror to check her makeup one final time, though I knew she was really scanning for any signs of second thoughts in her own eyes. At 21, she was the practical one among us, always carrying extra supplies and asking the questions the rest of us were too proud to voice. Jade settled in beside me in the back, her dark hair already escaping from its ponytail in the oppressive heat. She was the youngest at 20, but something about her always seemed older, more attuned to dangers the rest of us missed entirely. The road leading toward what locals called the deep woods was a deteriorating ribbon of asphalt that municipal services had apparently forgotten decades ago. Weeds erupted through every crack, creating a green carpet that our tires crushed with wet organic sounds. Marcus kept making jokes about missing hikers and bodies buried in shallow graves, his voice carrying that forced lightness people use when they're trying to convince themselves they're not nervous. None of us laughed genuinely, but we manufactured chuckles anyway, like we were all participating in some unspoken agreement to maintain the illusion of bravery. Remember that story about the family that went missing out here in '92? Marcus called over the rattling air conditioning. They found their car 3 weeks later, but never found them. That's just urban legend crap, Vanessa replied, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the door handle. Sure it is, Jade murmured from beside me, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. That's what they always say until it happens to you. I felt my stomach clench as we passed a hand-painted sign so weathered I could barely make out the words, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." The paint was rust-colored and peeling, giving it the appearance of dried blood flaking away from bone-white wood. Someone had taken a shotgun to it at some point, leaving jagged holes that made the letters look like they were screaming. By the time Marcus found a spot where the tree line created enough shadow to hide the car from any passing patrol vehicles, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting everything in that particular golden light that photographers love but that has always made me uneasy. There's something about that time of day that makes ordinary objects look ominous, transforms familiar shapes into potential threats lurking just beyond clear vision. The cornfields stretched out on both sides of us like walls built by some agricultural architect with claustrophobic intentions. The stalks stood nearly 8 feet tall, their broad leaves rustling with each breath of wind in a sound like whispered secrets. We shouldered our packs and began walking directly into the maze of green, following what might have been a deer path or might have been something else entirely. My legs immediately began collecting scratches from the rough corn leaves, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure following us between the rows. The rational part of my mind knew this was ridiculous. We were just walking through farmland, nothing more threatening than insects and maybe a startled raccoon. But rational thought has a way of evaporating when you're surrounded by something that blocks your view in every direction. Vanessa kept swatting at mosquitoes and flies that seemed to materialize from nowhere, her breathing becoming labored in the thick, humid air trapped between the corn rows. Every time she flinched or slapped at her neck, I felt my own tension ratchet up another notch, like we were all connected by invisible wires that transmitted fear as efficiently as copper conducts electricity. Jesus! "How far does this corn go?" she panted, after we'd been walking for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. "Don't use the Lord's name in vain," Jade said quietly, though there was no reproach in her voice, just an automatic correction born from childhood habit. "Sorry. How far does this stuff go?" Vanessa amended. "According to the map, we should hit the tree line soon," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Being the one who'd suggested this expedition, I felt responsible for everyone's safety, a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each step deeper into the unknown. The corn finally gave way to actual forest, and I felt momentarily relieved until I realized that the trees presented their own form of claustrophobia. Ancient oaks and maples created a canopy so thick that the temperature dropped immediately, and the quality of light shifted from warm gold to a greenish-gray twilight that made everything look underwater. We followed what appeared to be a game trail, though it was barely more than a depression in the accumulated leaves and organic debris of countless seasons. My boots caught on twisted roots and hidden rocks with alarming regularity, and more than once I had to grab onto low-hanging branches to keep from falling face first into the undergrowth. The others were having similar difficulties, but none of us wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. Pride has killed more people than bullets, my grandfather used to say, and I was beginning to understand what he meant. After stumbling through increasingly dense forest for over an hour, we finally discovered what could generously be called a clearing, really just a patch of ground where the trees stood far enough apart that we could set up a tent without having to move fallen logs. The space felt carved out rather than natural, as if something large had bulldozed through the forest and left this hollow behind. Even in daylight, something about the area felt wrong, like we were trespassing in a space that had been claimed by something else long before we arrived. Marcus immediately began wrestling with tent poles, cursing under his breath each time a stake refused to penetrate the hard-packed earth. The ground beneath our feet felt strange, too solid, too uniform, as if it had been compressed by heavy machinery or trampled by something much larger than deer. When I knelt to help with the tent stakes, I noticed that the soil had an unusual reddish tint that didn't match the brown earth we'd been walking on during our hike. "This dirt looks weird," I mentioned to Jade, who was gathering fallen branches for kindling. She crouched beside me and ran her fingers through the soil, then held them up to examine the residue. "It's like clay, but wrong somehow. And it smells—" She paused, sniffing her fingertips. "It smells like iron." Vanessa had wandered to the edge of our makeshift campsite, where she stood with her arms wrapped around herself despite the lingering heat of the day. "Guys," she called softly, "come look at this." We joined her at what she was examining, a tree trunk that stood just beyond the perimeter of our clearing. Deep gouges scarred the bark, running from about 7 feet high down to the root level. The marks were too regular to be natural damage, too deep to be made by any animal I could identify. Each gouge was roughly parallel to the others, spaced about 2 inches apart, as if something with multiple claws had raked down the entire length of the tree.
"Bear,"
Marcus suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. "Wrong pattern," Jade said immediately. "Bear claws would be closer together and they'd dig in at different angles. These look almost deliberate." I ran my hand over the gouges, feeling how the wood had been torn rather than cut. Whatever had made these marks had done so with tremendous force, peeling away bark and digging into the hardwood beneath. The scars were old, weathered gray, where the raw wood had been exposed to seasons of rain and sun, but not ancient. Maybe a year or two at most. As we worked to set up our camp, I kept noticing similar markings on other trees around the clearing, always at roughly the same height, always with that same parallel pattern, always oriented toward our campsite as if whatever had made them had been circling this exact spot. I didn't point out these additional marks to the others, not wanting to escalate the unease that was already settling over our group like fog. The sun disappeared with the sudden finality that happens in heavily wooded areas, and the temperature plummeted at least 15 degrees within the span of 20 minutes. We huddled around our small fire, feeding it twigs and dry leaves while trying to ignore the wall of absolute blackness that pressed in around our tiny circle of light. In the city, darkness is never complete. Streetlights, house lights, car headlights create a continuous glow that makes night feel manageable. But here, beyond the reach of our fire, the darkness was so total it seemed solid, like a black curtain we could reach out and touch. "Remember camping when we were kids," Vanessa said, clearly trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. "Everything seemed so much less." She gestured vaguely at the surrounding void. "Threatening?" I supplied. I was going to say huge. When you're 8 years old, camping in your backyard feels like a major adventure. Now, actual wilderness feels like it wants to eat us, Marcus finished, tossing another branch onto the fire. The flames leaped higher, pushing back the darkness by maybe another foot or two. That's when we heard the first sound. It came from somewhere beyond the firelight, a soft rustling that could have been wind in the leaves, except there was no wind. The air was completely still, so still that our fire burned straight up without even a flicker. The rustling continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making the sound had suddenly become aware of our attention. We sat in perfect silence, straining to hear anything else. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure the others could hear it. After what felt like several minutes, the rustling resumed, but from a different direction this time. It moved in a slow arc around our campsite, never coming close enough for us to see anything, but maintaining a consistent distance like something walking in a careful circle. "Raccoon," Marcus said, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "Raccoons don't move like that," Jade replied. "They're not that methodical." The circling continued for nearly half an hour. Sometimes the sound stopped entirely for long stretches, leaving us wondering if whatever was out there had moved on. But then they would resume from yet another direction, always the same distance away, always moving with that same deliberate, unhurried pace. Then came the breaking branches. The first one snapped somewhere to our left, a sound like a gunshot in the still air. It was followed immediately by another, then another, each one closer than the last. These weren't small twigs breaking under the weight of a squirrel or bird. These were substantial branches, the kind that require significant force to break. "Okay, that's definitely not a raccoon," Vanessa said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam toward the sounds, but the light seemed to die just a few feet beyond our fire, swallowed by the darkness like it was being absorbed by something hungry. The breaking sound stopped the moment I turned on the flashlight, but I could swear I saw something moving just at the edge of the beam's reach, a shape too large and too upright to be any forest animal I knew about. "Turn it off," Jade hissed. "You're just making us a target." I clicked off the flashlight, and we sat in tense silence. The fire suddenly seemed pitifully small, a candle trying to hold back an ocean of darkness. Minutes passed with no sound except our own breathing and the soft crackling of burning wood. Then we heard footsteps. Not the padding of animal paws or the scratching of claws on leaves, but actual footsteps, the deliberate placement of feet moving through the forest with obvious intelligence and purpose. They came from directly behind me, close enough that I could hear individual leaves crunching under what sounded like boots or heavy shoes. I started to turn around, but Jade's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. "Don't," she whispered so quietly. I almost missed it. "Don't turn around. Don't look. Just sit still." The footsteps continued, passing behind us so close I could have reached out and touched whatever was making them. They were heavy, measured, like someone walking with complete confidence despite the darkness and rough terrain. As they passed, I caught a scent that made my stomach clench, not the clean smell of pine and earth I'd been breathing all day, but something organic and rotten, like meat left in the sun too long. The footsteps continued around our campsite in the same wide circle the earlier sounds had followed, but this time there was no pretense of stealth. Whatever was out there wanted us to know it was there, wanted us to hear every deliberate step as it catalogued our position, our numbers, our level of fear. "We need to leave," Vanessa said, her voice shaking. "Right now, we need to pack up and get out of here." "In the dark?" Marcus asked. "Through those woods, we'll get lost, or hurt, or worse," I finished, because the alternative was becoming clear to all of us. Whatever was circling our camp wasn't just curious wildlife. It was intelligent, patient, and had been watching us since we arrived, maybe longer. The footsteps stopped directly in front of our campsite, just beyond the reach of our firelight. We stared into the darkness, knowing something was staring back at us, evaluating us, deciding what to do with us. I found myself holding my breath, afraid that even the sound of breathing might provoke whatever was out there into action. Then, from the darkness just yards away, came a sound that turned my blood to ice water in my veins, the slow, deliberate sound of someone clapping their hands. Clap, clap, clap. 3 slow, mocking claps, like applause for a performance we didn't know we'd been giving. That's when we ran. We abandoned everything except what we could grab in the first seconds of pure terror, flashlights, car keys, whatever was within arm's reach, as we scattered from our campsite like startled animals. The fire continued burning behind us as we crashed into the forest, our panic making us loud and clumsy as we stumbled over roots and slammed into low branches that seemed to reach out specifically to catch our clothes and scratch our faces. I could hear the others behind me, their breathing harsh and labored as we tried to retrace our path in complete darkness. My flashlight beam jumped wildly with each running step, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the forest look like something from a nightmare. Trees appeared and disappeared in the bouncing light, and I kept expecting to see a figure standing motionless among them, watching our retreat with amusement. "Stay together," I yelled over my shoulder, though I wasn't sure if the others could hear me over the sound of their own crashing progress through the undergrowth. The beam of my flashlight caught Vanessa's face for a moment, her eyes wide with terror, a long scratch bleeding down her left cheek where a branch had caught her. We reached what I thought was the edge of the forest and plunged into what should have been the cornfield we'd walked through earlier, but something was wrong. The corn was taller than I remembered, and thicker, and the rows seemed to run in different directions than they had during our afternoon hike. My rational mind tried to tell me that corn all looks the same in the dark, that panic was making me confused and disoriented, but deep down I knew we weren't in the same field we'd entered through. The corn stalks pressed in around us like living walls, their leaves rustling with every movement in a susurrating whisper that sounded almost like voices. The rows were so narrow we had to walk single file, and I could hear Marcus behind me cursing as he tried to force his way through stalks that seemed determined to block his passage. "Which way?" Vanessa called out, her voice muffled by the corn and tight with barely controlled hysteria. I stopped and tried to get my bearings, sweeping my flashlight beam in all directions, but every direction looked identical, endless rows of corn stretching away into darkness. The logical thing would have been to pick a direction and stick with it, but logic was in short supply. The corn seemed to be moving around us, rustling and shifting even when there was no wind, and I kept catching glimpses of movement between the rows that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. "This way," I said, picking a direction at random and hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. We began pushing through the corn again, the stalks scratching at our arms and faces with what felt like deliberate malice. The ground beneath our feet was soft and spongy, like we were walking on a carpet of decomposing organic matter. With each step, my boots sank slightly into the earth, and I could smell the rich, cloying scent of rot rising from the disturbed soil. That's when I realized we weren't alone in the corn. The sound started subtly, a rustling that didn't match our own movement. Footsteps that seemed to echo our own but came from just slightly the wrong direction. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the acoustics of being surrounded by tall plants, the way sound bounces and reflects in confined spaces. But as we continued walking, the sounds became more distinct, more obviously separate from our own noise. Something was pacing us, moving parallel to our path through the corn. Worse, it sounded like multiple somethings' footsteps coming from our left, our right, behind us. We were being herded, guided through the maze of corn like livestock being driven toward a slaughter pen. "Do you hear that?" Jade whispered, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. "Yeah," I replied, not wanting to elaborate because I was afraid that speaking our fears aloud would somehow make them more real, more dangerous. The sounds grew bolder as we continued walking. Branches snapped deliberately, stalks were pushed aside with obvious force, and occasionally I would hear what sounded like heavy breathing coming from just a few rows away. My flashlight was starting to dim, the battery weakening from overuse, and the beam was no longer strong enough to penetrate very far into the corn. We were walking through an increasingly small bubble of yellow light surrounded by an ocean of rustling, moving darkness. Then Vanessa screamed. It wasn't a scream of surprise or fear, but of pure terror, the sound a person makes when they see something that fundamentally violates their understanding of what's possible in the world. I spun around and saw her pointing at something between the corn rows behind us, her face white in the dying light of my flashlight. "There's someone there," she shrieked, "standing right there, just watching us." I directed my light toward where she was pointing, but I saw only corn stalks swaying gently as if something had just moved away. The absence was somehow more terrifying than a presence would have been. It meant that whatever she'd seen had moved with inhuman speed the moment my light touched it. "We need to run," Marcus said, his voice absolutely flat. "Right now, we need to run as fast as we can and not stop until we reach the car." We ran. We crashed through the corn like wild animals, no longer caring about the direction, just desperate to get away from whatever was hunting us through the maze of stalks. Corn leaves slashed at our faces and arms, leaving long stinging cuts, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror that drove us forward. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more aggressive, multiple sets of footsteps converging on our path, branches breaking as heavy bodies forced their way through the corn. My flashlight finally died completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. We kept running anyway, guided only by the sound of each other's movement and the desperate hope that we were heading towards safety rather than deeper into danger. I could hear Jade sobbing as she ran, and Marcus was making a low, keening sound like a wounded animal. Then suddenly, we burst out of the corn onto what felt like a gravel road. The relief was so intense it made my knees weak, and I stumbled and nearly fell as my boots hit the hard surface. We stood there gasping, looking back at the wall of corn we'd just escaped from. In the starlight, the stalks looked innocent, almost peaceful, swaying gently in a breeze that hadn't existed while we were trapped among them. "The car," Vanessa panted. "Where's the car?" We looked around frantically, trying to get our bearings on the unfamiliar road. Nothing looked right. The trees were wrong. The road surface was different. Even the smell of the air had changed. We weren't where we were supposed to be, but we were out of the corn, and that was all that mattered. We started walking along the road, staying close together and jumping at every small sound. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, and I kept looking over my shoulder at the corn, expecting to see figures emerging from between the stalks. But the corn remained still and silent, as if it had never contained anything more threatening than field mice and insects. It took us nearly an hour of walking to find Marcus's car, sitting exactly where we'd left it, but somehow looking different in the darkness. Smaller, more vulnerable, like a child's toy abandoned in a vast and hostile landscape. We piled into it without speaking, and Marcus started the engine with hands that shook so badly he had trouble getting the key into the ignition. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the corn and the dark line of trees beyond it. For just a moment, I thought I saw lights moving between the stalks, not flashlights or any kind of artificial illumination, but a cold, blue-white glow that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Then we rounded a curve in the road, and the lights disappeared behind us. None of us spoke during the drive home. What was there to say? That we'd been hunted through a cornfield by something that shouldn't exist. That we'd abandoned our camping gear and fled like cowards from shadows and sound effects. Better to pretend it had all been panic and imagination. That morning would reveal rational explanations for everything we'd experienced. But I knew, even as I tried to convince myself otherwise, that we would have to go back. Our tents, sleeping bags, and most of our camping equipment were still out there in that clearing, and we couldn't afford to replace everything. More than that, some part of me needed to prove that what we'd experienced had been nothing more than overactive imaginations and the disorienting effects of darkness in an unfamiliar place. I was wrong about a lot of things that night, but I was absolutely right about one. We would have to go back. And when we did, we would discover that our nightmare was just beginning. Marcus showed up at my apartment at 6 in the morning, standing on my doorstep with bags under his eyes and his hair still sticking up at odd angles. He looked like he'd slept about as well as I had, which is to say not at all. I'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound and shadow from our disastrous camping trip, trying to convince myself that daylight would strip away the terror and reveal simple, rational explanations for everything we'd experienced. "We have to go back," he said without preamble, holding up his car keys. "I can't stop thinking about our gear. That tent cost me $300, and my sleeping bag was a graduation gift from my mom. Plus, Vanessa left her backpack with her medication in it." I nodded, having reached the same conclusion during my sleepless night. Beyond the practical considerations, I needed to prove to myself that we'd been victims of our own imagination, that the terrors of the previous night would evaporate under the harsh light of day like morning frost on grass. We collected Vanessa and Jade without much discussion. Both looked as haggard as we felt, but neither protested when we explained our plan. There's something about shared trauma that creates its own momentum. We were bound together now by what we'd experienced, and we would face the aftermath together as well. The drive back to the woods felt different in daylight. The road that had seemed so ominous the day before now looked mundane, just another rural backwater that county maintenance had forgotten. The cornfields were just cornfields, green and ordinary in the morning sun. Farm equipment moved in the distance, and I could see a house with smoke rising from its chimney. Normal signs of human habitation that made our panic from the night before seem ridiculous. God, it looks so different, Vanessa said, echoing my thoughts. She was sitting in the passenger seat, applying concealer to the scratches on her face with the help of the visor mirror. How did we get so freaked out by this place? Darkness plays tricks on your mind, Marcus replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He wanted to believe it as much as the rest of us, but belief and knowing are different things entirely. We parked in the same spot and began retracing our steps into the forest. The game trail that had seemed so treacherous in the dark was clearly visible now, marked by our own footprints from the day before, and lined with broken branches where we'd forced our way through in our panicked retreat. Everything looked smaller in daylight, the trees less imposing, the shadows less threatening, the overall atmosphere more like a nature preserve than a haunted wilderness. There, Jade pointed ahead. I can see the clearing. She was right. Through the trees I could make out the small open space where we'd attempted to set up our camp. Even from a distance I could see the blackened remains of our fire pit and what looked like scattered equipment. We definitely found the right place. But as we got closer, something felt wrong. The clearing looked different than I remembered, though I couldn't immediately put my finger on what had changed. The trees surrounding it seemed to lean in more sharply, creating deeper shadows despite the morning sun. The ground itself appeared darker, almost black in some spots, as if something had stained the earth during the night. Our camping gear was scattered across the clearing in a pattern that made no sense. The tent had been completely collapsed, but not in the way a tent falls when the stakes are pulled up or the poles collapse. It looked like something heavy had walked across it, leaving deep impressions in the fabric. My sleeping bag was hanging from a tree branch 15 feet off the ground, torn open so that synthetic filling drifted down like snow. Vanessa's backpack had been ripped apart, its contents strewn across the clearing as if someone had been searching for something specific. Animals, Marcus said, but his voice carried no conviction. Bears, maybe, or raccoons looking for food. I knelt beside the remains of our fire pit and immediately saw something that made my stomach clench. Mixed in with the cold ashes were what looked like bones, small ones, like from birds or squirrels, but burned black and arranged in patterns that couldn't possibly be natural. Someone or something had been using our fire after we fled, feeding it with fuel we definitely hadn't left behind. Guys, Vanessa called from the edge of the clearing. Look at this. We joined her where she stood beside one of the larger oak trees. The trunk was covered with fresh gouges, similar to the ones we'd noticed the day before, but deeper and more extensive. These marks were definitely new. Sap was still bleeding from the wounds, and I could smell the sharp, clean scent of freshly damaged wood. Something was here after we left, Jade said quietly. Something big and strong and really, really angry. That's when we heard the voice calling from deeper in the forest. Marco. The word drifted through the trees, clear and unmistakable. A human voice, definitely, but there was something off about it. The tone was too cheerful, too playful for the circumstances. It sounded like someone inviting us to join a game, but the underlying current suggested it was a game we wouldn't enjoy playing. We looked at each other, and I could see the same question in everyone's eyes. Should we investigate, or should we grab what we could salvage from our gear and get out of there immediately? It's just someone else camping, Marcus said, though he made no move toward the sound. Maybe they can help us figure out what happened to our stuff. Or maybe they're the ones who destroyed our stuff, Vanessa countered. The voice came again, from a slightly different direction this time. Marco. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave immediately, I found myself curious. In full daylight, surrounded by my friends, with houses and farms not more than a few miles away. How dangerous could one person calling out in the woods really be? Polo, I shouted back before I could stop myself. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the entire ecosystem had suddenly held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, from much closer than the original voice had been, Marco. This time the playful tone was gone. The voice was flat, neutral, almost mechanical in its lack of emotion. And it was definitely closer, maybe 50 yards away instead of the 100 or more the first call had seemed to come from. We should go, Jade said, grabbing my arm. Right now. We should take whatever we can carry and get out of here. But I was already calling back. Polo. I don't know what compelled me to continue the game. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same stubborn pride that had gotten us into this situation in the first place. Or maybe something else was influencing my decisions in ways I didn't understand. Whatever the reason, I found myself leading our group deeper into the forest, following the voice as it continued to call out Marco from different locations. Each response seemed to come from closer than the last, and each time the voice sounded less human. The playful quality disappeared entirely, replaced by something cold and mechanical, like a recording being played through speakers hidden among the trees. But we kept following, drawn by a compulsion that felt stronger than mere curiosity. The trees grew thicker as we went deeper, and the canopy overhead became so dense that it felt like walking through a green tunnel. The air grew cooler and took on a musty smell, like old newspapers stored in a damp basement. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the forest floor, and I noticed that we weren't hearing any of the normal sounds you'd expect in a healthy ecosystem. No birdsong, no buzzing insects, no small animals scurrying through the undergrowth. Marco. The voice was very close now, maybe 20 yards ahead of us. Polo, I replied automatically, though by now my heart was hammering and every nerve in my body was screaming warnings. Marco. This time the voice came from behind us. We spun around but saw nothing except the green tunnel of forest we'd just walked through. When we turned back toward our original direction, there was someone standing in the shadows between the trees. At least I thought it was someone. The figure was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. It stood too still, like a mannequin, but there were subtle movements that suggested life, a slight swaying, like someone trying to maintain balance on an unsteady surface. Found you, the figure said, and its voice was nothing like the playful calls that had lured us deeper into the forest. This voice was dry and hollow, like wind blowing through empty spaces. That's when we ran again, crashing back through the forest toward what we hoped was the direction of our cars. But the trees seemed to shift around us, and paths that had been clear moments before were now blocked by fallen logs or thick tangles of undergrowth. We were lost, disoriented, and being hunted by something that played games with human voices but was definitely not human itself. The forest had changed around us, and we were no longer the hunters returning to reclaim our possessions. We had become the prey. We ran blindly through the increasingly dense forest, branches whipping across our faces and roots catching our feet with every step. Behind us I could hear that voice continuing to call out Marco at regular intervals, but now it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, as if whatever was hunting us had multiplied, or as if the forest itself had learned to mimic human speech and was using it to confuse and disorient us. My lungs burned as we crashed through undergrowth that seemed determined to slow our progress. Thorns caught at our clothing, and low-hanging branches formed barriers that we had to duck under or push aside. The forest was actively working against us, or at least that's how it felt as we struggled to find our way back to familiar territory. Stop, Jade gasped, grabbing onto a tree trunk to support herself. We're just going in circles. Listen. We paused, breathing heavily, and tried to get our bearings. She was right. The voices calling Marco were coming from all around us now, sometimes from ground level, sometimes from high up in the trees, sometimes from what sounded like underground. The calls had multiplied and changed, becoming a twisted chorus that bore no resemblance to the single playful voice we'd initially heard. "What the hell is that?" Vanessa whispered, her face pale and streaked with sweat. I couldn't answer because I didn't have an answer that made any sense. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find explanations. Maybe it was a group of people playing an elaborate prank, or maybe we'd stumbled into some kind of military training exercise, or maybe we were all suffering from shared hysteria brought on by the stress of our previous night's experience. But none of those explanations felt adequate to explain what we were hearing. The voices were wrong in fundamental ways that went beyond simple deception. They had the rhythm and intonation of human speech, but lacked the organic quality that comes from actual vocal cords and breath passing through living throats. It was like listening to a computer trying to imitate human conversation, technically accurate but missing some essential quality that would make it convincing. "Polo," came a whispered response from somewhere very close to us. We hadn't called out Marco. The voices were now responding to each other, carrying on conversations that followed the rules of the children's game, but existed independent of our participation. We had become observers to something that was using our game as a framework for its own incomprehensible purposes. "We need to find the fence," I said, trying to recall the layout of the forest from our previous day's exploration. "Remember the barbed wire fence we saw? If we can find that, we can follow it back to familiar territory." It was a desperate plan, but it was better than standing still while those voices closed in around us from every direction. We began moving again, trying to stay quiet while searching for any sign of the rusted fence that had marked the boundary of the abandoned property we'd glimpsed earlier. The voices followed us, maintaining their impossible conversation of Marco and Polo calls that seemed to come from creatures that could move through the forest without making any other sound. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves, no breaking of branches, just those hollow mechanical voices drifting through the trees like radio signals from another dimension. Then Marcus grabbed my arm and pointed ahead. "There," he whispered. Through the trees, I could see the dull glint of rusted metal, the barbed wire fence we'd encountered during our previous exploration. It looked exactly the same as before, sagging and overgrown with vines, marking the boundary of what had once been someone's property but was now just another section of abandoned wilderness. We approached the fence cautiously, aware that the voices had gone silent. The sudden absence of sound was somehow more unsettling than the chorus of calls had been. At least when they were calling out, we knew approximately where they were. Now they could be anywhere, watching us from concealment while we tried to find our way to safety. The fence stretched away in both directions, disappearing into the forest. If we followed it, we would eventually reach either a road or another boundary marker that might help us orient ourselves. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only plan we had. We began walking parallel to the fence line, staying just inside the forest to avoid getting tangled in the barbed wire, but keeping the metal strands in sight as our guide. The going was easier here. Whoever had originally installed the fence had cleared a corridor on both sides, and though it was now overgrown, the vegetation was less dense than in the deeper forest. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, we came to a section where the fence had been deliberately cut. The wire strands hung loose, and the wooden posts had been pushed aside to create an opening wide enough for people to pass through easily. The cuts in the wire were clean and recent, made with proper tools rather than damaged by weather or age. "Someone's been maintaining this," Jade observed, running her finger along one of the cut wire ends. "This wasn't done years ago. This is recent." Beyond the gap in the fence, we could see what remained of the building foundation we'd glimpsed the day before. But in full daylight, it looked different than it had during our previous brief encounter. What I had initially taken for the remains of an old farmhouse or barn was actually something larger and more complex. The foundation of what might have been a small compound, with multiple rooms and corridors visible in the weathered concrete and stone. More importantly, there were obvious signs of recent human activity. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near the foundation, cigarette butts that hadn't been weathered by rain, and what looked like the remains of recent campfires in several of the ruined rooms. Someone had been using this place regularly, and recently. "Drug dealers," Marcus said immediately. "Has to be. Remote location, abandoned buildings, cut fence for easy access. We stumbled into somebody's operation." It was a rational explanation, and one that made the previous night's encounters take on a much more sinister significance. If this was indeed some kind of illegal operation, then the sounds we'd heard in the forest might not have been anything supernatural at all, just people trying to scare us away from an area they wanted to keep secret. But that didn't explain the voices we'd just heard, or the way they'd seemed to come from impossible locations, or the mechanical quality that had made them sound like recordings rather than live speech. "We should go," Vanessa said. "Right now. If this is what I think it is, we don't want to be anywhere near here when whoever uses this place comes back." She was absolutely right. But as we started to turn away from the ruined foundation, I heard something that made me freeze in place. "Help me." The voice was different from the mechanical Marco Polo calls we'd been hearing. This one sounded genuinely human, weak, scared, and coming from somewhere within the ruins themselves. It was the voice of someone in real distress, someone who might have been injured or trapped in the abandoned buildings. "Please," the voice called again. "I'm hurt. I can't get out." I looked at the others and saw the same conflict reflected in their faces. Every instinct told us to run, to get as far away from this place as possible before we encountered whatever was responsible for the strange voices and the obvious signs of recent activity. But there was someone in those ruins who needed help, someone who might die if we simply walked away. It could be a trap, Jade said quietly, voicing what we were all thinking. Or it could be someone who really needs help, I replied. The voice called out again, weaker this time. Please, I think my leg is broken. I've been here all night. That decided it for me. I couldn't walk away from someone who might be genuinely injured, regardless of how dangerous the situation might be. We have to check, I said. But we stay together, we stay alert, and if anything feels wrong, we run. We climbed through the gap in the fence and approached the ruined foundation cautiously, scanning for any sign of movement or concealment. The tire tracks were definitely fresh, probably made within the last day or two, and I could smell cigarette smoke lingering in the air, as if someone had been smoking here very recently. Where are you? I called out to the voice. Down here, came the reply from what looked like a cellar or basement area beneath the main foundation. I fell through some boards. I think there's something wrong with my leg. We found the opening. The voice was coming from a gap in the floor where old wooden planks had rotted through, creating a hole that dropped down into darkness. I could see rough stone walls disappearing into shadows, suggesting that the basement area was much larger than the foundation above ground would indicate. I turned on my phone's flashlight and directed the beam down into the opening. The light revealed a chamber that extended farther than I could see, with stone walls that looked much older than the relatively recent foundation above. This wasn't just a basement, it was some kind of underground structure that predated whatever building had once stood here. I can see you, the voice called from the darkness below. Thank God, I was starting to think no one would find me. But I couldn't see anyone in the beam of my flashlight. The underground chamber appeared to be empty except for fallen debris and what looked like the remains of old wooden furniture. Either the injured person was in a section of the chamber that my light couldn't reach, or... Where exactly are you? I called down. I'm shining a light, but I can't see you. There was a pause, longer than there should have been if someone was genuinely injured and eager for rescue. Then the voice spoke again, and this time it was different. Still recognizably the same voice, but with that mechanical quality we'd heard in the forest, like a recording being played through hidden speakers. I'm right here, the voice said. Can't you see me? I'm right here in front of you. The beam of my flashlight was illuminating empty stone and shadows. There was no one there. That's when I realized we'd been lured into a trap, and whatever had been calling to us from the forest had followed us here, using our own human compassion as bait to draw us into an even more dangerous situation. The voice began laughing, a sound that started human but gradually became something else entirely, something that no human throat could produce. And as the laughter echoed up from that dark chamber below, I heard footsteps behind us. Multiple sets of footsteps surrounding the ruined foundation, cutting off our escape routes. We were no longer alone. The footsteps approached from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a sound like an army advancing through the undergrowth with perfect coordination. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. The steps were too regular, too perfectly synchronized, like marching soldiers who had practiced their movements until they became mechanical rather than natural. We huddled together in the center of the ruined foundation, backs pressed against each other as we tried to watch all directions at once. My phone's flashlight seemed pitifully inadequate against the gathering shadows, creating a small circle of visibility that only emphasized how much darkness surrounded us on all sides. How many do you think there are? Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't answer because the footsteps made it impossible to count individual people. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if we were surrounded by an entire crowd moving in perfect unison. But I still couldn't see anyone, despite the fact that the footsteps were getting closer with each passing second. The laughter from the underground chamber had stopped, replaced by that same hollow voice calling out, "Don't run, we just want to play. It's such a simple game." "Who are you?" I shouted into the darkness, trying to project confidence I absolutely didn't feel. "What do you want?" "We want to play Marco Polo," the voice replied, and now it was definitely coming from multiple locations at once, not just from the underground opening, but from the trees surrounding the ruins, from the shadows cast by the broken walls, from everywhere and nowhere. "It's such a fun game. You seem to enjoy it so much." The footsteps stopped abruptly, creating a silence so complete it made my ears ring. We stood motionless, straining to hear any indication of where our unseen observers might be positioned, but the quiet was absolute. Even the normal forest sounds had disappeared entirely, as if every living creature in the area had fled or been silenced. Then, from the darkness just beyond my flashlight's reach, came a new sound, slow, deliberate clapping. It started with just one set of hands, clapping with that same measured rhythm we'd heard at our campsite the night before. But within seconds, it was joined by another, then another, until we were surrounded by what sounded like dozens of people applauding our performance. The clapping continued for nearly a minute, building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations beneath our feet. Then it stopped with the same sudden finality as the footsteps had, leaving us standing in a silence that felt pregnant with malicious anticipation. "Look down," the voice from the underground chamber commanded. "Look down and see what you've found." Against every instinct screaming at me not to comply, I directed my flashlight beam down into the opening in the floor. The light revealed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The underground chamber wasn't empty after all. It was filled with objects that had been arranged in careful patterns across the stone floor, personal belongings that looked like they'd been collected over years or even decades. Backpacks, sleeping bags, camping equipment, clothing, shoes, all arranged in neat rows like inventory in some nightmare warehouse. But it was the other items that made my hands shake as I held the flashlight. Mixed in with the camping gear were things that people wouldn't willingly leave behind. Eyeglasses, jewelry, wallets, car keys, cell phones. The kinds of personal effects that stay with someone unless they're taken by force or abandoned in moments of absolute terror. "How many people have you brought here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "So many," the voice replied, and now it sounded pleased, almost proud. "Hikers, campers, people who got lost, people who were looking for adventure. They all played our game eventually. Some were better at it than others." In the flashlight beam, I could see something else scattered among the personal belongings. Bones. Not animal bones this time, but unmistakably human remains, picked clean and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Skulls stacked in careful pyramids, femurs arranged like fence posts, rib cages nested inside each other like Russian dolls. "Oh God," Jade breathed behind me, and I could hear her starting to hyperventilate. "God isn't here," the voice replied with what sounded like amusement. "God doesn't come to places like this, but we do. We've been here for a very long time, waiting for new players." The clapping started again, but this time it was coming from the underground chamber itself. As I watched in horror, shapes began moving in the darkness below. Human figures, or things that had once been human figures, emerging from alcoves and crevices in the stone walls. They moved with that same mechanical precision I'd heard in their footsteps, like marionettes being controlled by an expert puppeteer. "Your turn to be it," one of them called up to us, and its voice was exactly the same as the one that had been speaking before. They all had the same voice, the same inflection, as if they were different instruments playing the same recording. That's when I understood. These weren't people at all, at least not anymore. They were something else, something that had learned to mimic human speech and behavior, but had never quite mastered the subtleties that would make the performance convincing. They were like actors who had memorized their lines perfectly, but had never understood the emotions behind the words. "Run," I said to the others, my voice surprisingly calm considering the terror coursing through my system. "Run now." We scattered from the ruins in different directions, abandoning any pretense of staying together in favor of making ourselves harder targets. Behind us, that horrible synchronized clapping erupted again, but now it was mixed with laughter and voices calling out Marco in perfect unison. I crashed through the forest without any regard for direction or safety, my only goal being to put as much distance as possible between myself and that underground chamber full of bones and stolen belongings. Branches tore at my clothes and face, and I could feel blood running down my cheeks from the deeper scratches, but the pain was nothing compared to the images burned into my memory. How many people had disappeared in these woods over the years? How many missing hiker reports had been filed and forgotten, attributed to people getting lost or falling into rivers, or simply deciding to start new lives somewhere else? And how many of those people had actually ended up in that underground chamber, their belongings arranged like trophies while their bones were stacked like cordwood? I could hear the others crashing through the forest in different directions, and I hoped they were making better progress than I was. The trees seemed to close in around me with each step, and I kept having to change direction to avoid impenetrable tangles of undergrowth or fallen logs that blocked my path. Behind me, the voices were still calling out their mechanical chorus of Marco, but they were getting fainter as I put distance between myself and the ruins. Either they weren't following me, or they were following but maintaining their distance, content to let me exhaust myself in panicked flight through unfamiliar terrain. Then I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks, the sound of a car engine starting. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, in the direction I'd been running, not the familiar sound of Marcus's sedan, but something larger and rougher, like a truck or SUV with a diesel engine. The sound was accompanied by voices, real human voices this time, not the mechanical approximations I'd been hearing from the ruins. I crept forward carefully, trying to get close enough to see what was happening without exposing myself. Through the trees, I could make out a clearing where several vehicles were parked, a large pickup truck, a van with tinted windows, and what looked like an ATV with oversized tires for rough terrain. 3 men stood near the vehicles, dressed in hunting clothes and carrying what looked like military-style rifles. They were talking in low voices, but I was close enough to hear fragments of their conversation. Heard them running through the woods. Probably scared them off good this time.
Boss wants us to make sure they don't come back.
These weren't the mechanical voices from the ruins. These were real people, discussing us like we were a problem that needed to be solved. I began to understand that what we'd encountered wasn't supernatural at all. It was something much more mundane and infinitely more dangerous. We had stumbled into the territory of people who were using these woods for purposes they wanted to keep absolutely secret, and they had developed an elaborate system for scaring away unwanted visitors. The mechanical voices, the synchronized footsteps, the underground chamber full of belongings, it was all theater, designed to create the impression of something supernatural while concealing very human criminal activity. But if that was true, then the bones I'd seen weren't just props. They were real human remains, belonging to people who had gotten too close to whatever operation was being run from this remote location. People who had been eliminated not by monsters or ghosts, but by men with guns who were willing to kill to protect their secrets. I needed to find the others and get us all out of these woods before we became permanent additions to that underground collection. But first I needed to figure out exactly what we'd stumbled into, and who was responsible for turning this remote forest into a killing ground. The answers were somewhere in that clearing, with the vehicles and armed men. And despite every instinct telling me to run, I knew I had to get closer and find out what we were really dealing with. Because running blindly through unfamiliar woods might get us away from immediate danger, but it wouldn't protect us from people who knew these forests intimately and had resources we couldn't match. If we were going to survive this, we needed information. And information meant taking risks that could get us all killed. I crept closer to the clearing where the men with guns were talking, using every bit of cover the forest provided while trying to hear more of their conversation. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I was sure they would hear it, but they seemed focused on their discussion and unaware of my presence in the shadows. The sound system worked perfectly, one of them was saying. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair, and the kind of weathered face that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. Had them running in circles for hours before they finally found the ruins. "Boss is going to be pleased," replied another man, shorter and stockier, with arms covered in tattoos that looked like they'd been done in prison. "That's the 3rd group this month we've scared off without having to get our hands dirty." The 3rd man, younger than the others and nervous-looking, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "What if they come back? What if they bring the police?" "They won't," the older man said with absolute confidence. "Nobody ever comes back after they see the bone room. We've been running this operation for 12 years, and not one person who's seen what we want them to see has ever returned or talked to authorities." My blood turned to ice as I realized what he was saying. The underground chamber full of bones and personal belongings wasn't just a deterrent, it was a carefully constructed psychological weapon designed to create trauma so intense that witnesses would never speak about what they'd seen. The bones were real, belonging to people who had genuinely disappeared in these woods, but they weren't being used as evidence of supernatural activity. They were being used as evidence of something much worse. "How many people has the boss actually killed?" the young one asked. "Shut up," the tattooed man snapped. "We don't talk about that stuff out here. Walls have ears, even in the middle of nowhere." But the older man seemed unconcerned. "Kid's got a right to know what he's gotten himself into. The boss has been using these woods for his operation since 2008. Sometimes people stumble onto things they shouldn't see. Sometimes hikers get curious about the buildings. Sometimes campers set up too close to the processing facilities. When that happens, well," he shrugged, "problems get solved permanently." "How many?" the young man pressed. "Officially, 0. There's no official count because officially nobody's been murdered here. People go missing in these woods all the time. It's easy to get lost, easy to fall into ravines, easy to get attacked by wildlife. The bones in that chamber, those are from people who died of natural causes, accidents, animal attacks. We just collect them, arrange them in ways that create the right psychological impact." I felt sick to my stomach as I began to understand the full scope of what we'd walked into. This wasn't just a drug operation or some other standard criminal enterprise. This was something much more sophisticated and horrifying. A system designed to eliminate witnesses while maintaining complete deniability. The mechanical voices, the synchronized footsteps, the elaborate psychological theater. It was all designed to create an experience so traumatic and surreal that anyone who survived it would either be too psychologically damaged to report it coherently, or would convince themselves it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and fear. "The speakers are motion-activated," the older man continued, apparently enjoying the opportunity to explain their system. "Sensors detect when someone enters the forest, and the playback begins automatically. Different recordings for different situations. Children's games to lure people deeper, cries for help to exploit their compassion, mechanical voices to create psychological confusion. Works like a charm every time." "What about the ones who don't run?" the young man asked. "What about the ones who are too curious, or too brave, or too stupid to be scared off?" The older man's expression grew cold. "Those ones get to meet the boss personally, and after that meeting they become part of the bone collection for real." I had heard enough, more than enough. I needed to find the others and get us all out of these woods immediately, before we transitioned from being targets of psychological warfare to being targets of actual murder. We had been incredibly lucky so far. Our terror had saved our lives by making us run instead of investigating further. But luck has a way of running out, especially when you're dealing with people who have turned killing into a systematic operation. I began backing away from the clearing as carefully as possible, trying not to make any sound that might alert the 3 men to my presence. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and I was constantly expecting to hear a shout of alarm or the sound of weapons being cocked. I had made it maybe 20 yards when my foot came down on a dry branch that snapped with a sound like a gunshot. All conversation in the clearing stopped immediately. "What was that?" the young man asked, his voice tight with alarm. "Probably just an animal," the tattooed man replied, but I could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Or maybe one of our visitors is still in the area," the older man said. "Better check it out." I heard footsteps moving in my direction and abandoned all pretense of stealth. I ran through the forest as fast as I could manage, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs while branches whipped across my face and arms. Behind me I could hear the men pursuing, their progress much faster and more efficient than mine because they knew these woods intimately. "There," one of them shouted. "I saw movement over there." A gunshot echoed through the forest, and I heard the bullet slam into a tree trunk somewhere close to my left. They weren't just trying to capture me, they were shooting to kill, which meant I had learned too much for them to let me leave alive. I changed direction abruptly, hoping to confuse my pursuers, but almost immediately heard another gunshot and felt something burn across my shoulder. The bullet had grazed me, tearing through my shirt and leaving a bleeding furrow in my skin, but it wasn't a serious wound. What was serious was the fact that they were getting closer and their aim was improving. I needed to find the others, but I also needed to avoid leading armed killers directly to my friends. The smart thing would be to try to escape on my own and then bring help back for them, but that assumed I could actually escape, and right now that seemed increasingly unlikely. The men behind me knew these woods perfectly while I was completely lost. They had vehicles to cut off escape routes while I was on foot. They had weapons and training while I had nothing but desperation and fear. Then I heard something that gave me hope. Voices calling my name. "Over here," I shouted back, not caring if it revealed my location to my pursuers. "There are men with guns. They're trying to kill us." The voices came closer, and I could make out Marcus, Vanessa, and Jade calling back to me. They had managed to find each other and were looking for me, but they were about to walk directly into a kill zone. "Run," I screamed at them. "Get to the car and drive away. Get help." But even as I shouted the warning, I could hear vehicles starting up in the clearing behind me. The men weren't just pursuing us on foot, they were bringing their trucks and ATVs, which meant they could move much faster than we could and cover multiple escape routes simultaneously. We were being hunted by professionals who had been doing this for over a decade, and they had just decided that we needed to be eliminated permanently. The psychological warfare phase of our encounter was over. Now came the part where they tried to add our bones to their underground collection. The sound of engines roaring to life behind us galvanized our group into desperate action. We ran through the forest like animals fleeing a wildfire, no longer caring about direction or stealth, focused only on putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the men who were hunting us with lethal intent. Marcus had somehow managed to keep his car keys during our panicked flight, and he was leading us in what he swore was the direction of where we'd parked. But the forest all looked the same to me, endless trees and shadows that seemed to shift and change with every desperate glance over my shoulder. "How much farther?" Vanessa gasped as we stumbled through a particularly dense thicket. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, his voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "Everything looks different when you're running for your life." Behind us, I could hear the roar of engines getting closer. Our pursuers were using their vehicles to navigate service roads and hunting trails that we couldn't even see, positioning themselves to cut off our escape routes while we thrashed through the undergrowth like wounded deer. Then Jade grabbed my arm and pointed ahead. "There, I can see the cornfield." She was right. Through the trees, I could make out the edge of the tall corn stalks that marked the border between forest and farmland. If we could reach the corn, we might be able to lose our pursuers in the maze of stalks, at least long enough to reach our car and escape. We burst out of the forest and plunged into the corn rows, immediately surrounded by the rustling walls of green that had terrified us just the night before. But now, that same corn felt like salvation, cover that might hide us from men with guns who wanted to add us to their collection of bones. The corn was even taller than I remembered, the stalks towering over our heads and creating a labyrinth of identical pathways that stretched in every direction. We tried to move quietly, but every step seemed to generate enormous amounts of noise as we pushed through the plants and stepped on fallen leaves and husks. "Which way?" I whispered to Marcus. He looked around frantically, trying to orient himself in the maze of identical rows. "I think this way, maybe. God, it all looks the same." We started moving in the direction he'd indicated, staying close together to avoid getting separated in the corn. The stalks pressed in around us like living walls, their broad leaves brushing against our faces and arms with every step. The air was thick and humid, trapped between the rows and heavy with the smell of growing plants and rich earth. Then we heard voices calling to each other from somewhere in the corn behind us. "They went this way. I can see broken stalks. Spread out, don't let them reach the road." Our pursuers had followed us into the corn and were coordinating their search like experienced hunters. We tried to move faster, but the corn seemed determined to slow our progress, catching at our clothes and forcing us to push through resistant walls of vegetation. "There." Vanessa pointed ahead where the corn rows opened up to reveal a strip of bare ground, the road. We stumbled out of the corn onto the gravel road where Marcus had parked his car the day before. The sedan sat exactly where we'd left it, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Marcus fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the lock. "Hurry," Jade urged, looking back at the corn where we could hear our pursuers getting closer. The car doors finally opened, and we piled inside with desperate haste. Marcus turned the key in the ignition, and for one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the engine caught and roared to life, and he gunned the accelerator so hard the tires spun on the gravel before catching traction. We flew down the rural road at speeds that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances, but which felt barely adequate given the circumstances we were fleeing from. In the rearview mirror, I could see vehicles emerging from service roads behind us, the pickup truck and ATV from the clearing, pursuing us with obvious intent to run us down. "They're following us," I shouted over the engine noise. "I can see them," Marcus replied grimly, pressing the accelerator to the floor. His little sedan wasn't built for high-speed chases, but it was lighter than the trucks behind us, which gave us an advantage on the winding rural roads. We took curves at speeds that made the tires scream and the car slide sideways, but somehow Marcus kept us on the road while gradually increasing our lead over the pursuing vehicles. The men hunting us were driving more cautiously, probably because they couldn't afford to crash their vehicles and leave evidence of their pursuit. "Where are we going?" Vanessa asked, gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles were white. "Police station," Marcus said immediately. "We're going straight to the police and telling them everything." "Will they believe us?" Jade asked. "I mean, it sounds completely insane. Underground chambers full of bones, mechanical voices, men with guns running some kind of murder operation in the woods." She had a point. Our story sounded like something from a horror movie, and we had no evidence beyond our own testimony and the minor injuries we'd sustained during our escape. The men pursuing us were professionals who had been covering their tracks for over a decade. They wouldn't have left obvious evidence lying around for investigators to find. But we were alive, and that was more than many people who had encountered that operation could say. Whatever happened next, we had escaped when others hadn't, and that gave us an obligation to try to expose what was happening in those woods. The pursuing vehicles fell farther behind as we reached paved roads and could really open up the sedan's engine. Soon we couldn't see them at all in the rearview mirror, though I kept expecting them to appear around every curve. "I think we lost them," Marcus said, but he didn't slow down. We drove straight to the county sheriff's office, where we sat in the parking lot for several minutes, trying to calm down enough to tell our story coherently. We all looked like we'd been through hell, scratched, bloody, our clothes torn and dirty from crashing through the forest. "They're going to think we're on drugs," Vanessa said, examining her reflection in the visor mirror. "Maybe," I replied, "but they're also going to see that we're genuinely terrified and that something really did happen to us out there. Even if they don't believe the whole story, maybe they'll investigate enough to discover what's really going on." We walked into the sheriff's office together, and I began telling our story to the desk sergeant on duty. I tried to stick to the facts and avoid speculation, focusing on what we had actually seen and heard, rather than our interpretations of those events. The sergeant listened with professional attention, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I described the underground chamber full of bones and personal belongings, his expression became more serious, and he called over his supervisor. "You're sure about what you saw?" the supervisor asked. "Human bones, arranged in patterns, mixed with camping equipment and personal effects?" "Absolutely sure," I replied, "and there were men with guns who chased us out of the woods. They were talking about killing people who got too close to their operation." The supervisor exchanged a look with the desk sergeant. "We've had reports of missing hikers in that area over the years," he said. "Never found any bodies, never found any evidence of foul play. Most of the time, we assumed they'd gotten lost and died of exposure, or fallen into ravines where we couldn't recover the remains." "How many reports?" Jade asked. 12 or 13 over the past decade, maybe more. It's a big area, easy to get lost, lots of ways to have accidents, but if what you're telling me is true..." He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he was thinking. If our story was accurate, then those missing hikers hadn't died from accidents or exposure. They had been murdered by people who were using the remote forest as their personal killing ground. "We'll need you to give formal statements," the supervisor continued, "and we'll need you to guide investigators back to the location where you saw these things. Are you willing to do that?" I looked at the others, seeing my own fear reflected in their faces. Going back to those woods, even with police protection, was the last thing any of us wanted to do. But we were the only witnesses to what was happening there, the only people who could lead investigators to the evidence they would need to stop the killing. "Yes," I said finally, "we'll do whatever you need us to do." 3 days later, a joint task force of county sheriff's deputies, state police, and federal agents raided the compound in the woods. They found exactly what we had described, an elaborate underground facility filled with human remains and personal belongings from dozens of victims spanning more than a decade. They also found sophisticated audio equipment designed to create the psychological effects we had experienced, and detailed records of a drug manufacturing and distribution operation that had been using the remote location to process and ship narcotics across multiple states. 7 people were arrested in connection with the operation, including the 3 men who had pursued us through the forest. During interrogation, several of them provided information about additional burial sites and victim locations, leading to the recovery of remains from people who had been missing for years. The story made national news for several weeks, focusing on the innovative psychological tactics the criminals had used to deter investigation and the elaborate measures they had taken to conceal their activities. We were interviewed by multiple news outlets and documentary producers, though we were careful never to reveal our real names or identifying information. But the most important outcome was that the killing stopped. The operation was shut down permanently, the perpetrators were sentenced to life in prison, and the families of dozens of missing people finally got answers about what had happened to their loved ones. We never went camping together again. The experience had bonded us in ways that were both profound and uncomfortable, creating shared memories that were too intense to forget, but too traumatic to revisit casually. We remained friends, but our friendship was forever marked by the knowledge of what we had survived together. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up thinking I hear mechanical voices calling Marco from somewhere in the darkness outside my window. But they're just echoes of memory now, remnants of the worst 3 days of my life and the best outcome we could have hoped for given the circumstances. We went into those woods as naive young adults looking for adventure and escape from ordinary life. We came out as witnesses to horrors that most people never have to confront, and as the instruments of justice for people who had disappeared without anyone ever learning their fate. It wasn't the adventure we had planned, but it was the adventure that was waiting for us in the deep woods, where human monsters wore the masks of supernatural terror, and justice sometimes comes from the most unlikely heroes. The woods are quiet now, patrolled by rangers, and marked with warnings about the dangers of straying from designated trails. But sometimes on still nights when the wind is calm, locals say they can still hear echoes of voices calling out games that no one wants to play. The difference is that now everyone knows those voices belong to the dead, seeking justice that finally came too late for them, but just in time for us. When I was young, my parents would abandon me at my grandparents' house in Millfield almost every other weekend during the late 1990s. They lived in this decrepit 2-story Victorian with rotting wood siding and too many rooms that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. The place always reeked of mothballs and decay, mixed with whatever my grandmother was attempting to salvage from her ancient cookbooks. It wasn't the worst arrangement. I received stale cookies and dangerous amounts of neglect, except for one horrifying reality. Bruno. Bruno was my grandfather's obsession, a massive German shepherd that he'd acquired before my birth. By the time I was forming coherent memories around age 4, Bruno was already a seasoned predator disguised as a family pet. My grandfather Edmund had molded him through brutal training regimens for regional intimidation competitions when Bruno was younger. The basement wall displayed his grotesque trophies, ribbons and photographs of Bruno looking menacing beside my grandfather's twisted grin. To every visiting neighbor and family friend, Bruno represented the pinnacle of canine discipline and intelligence. To me, he embodied pure terror, given flesh and fur. The house itself seemed to conspire with Bruno's malevolence. Shadows lingered too long in corners where they had no business existing. Floorboards groaned under invisible weight during the darkest hours. Windows rattled without wind, and doors creaked open on their own, as if the structure itself was breathing. Shallow, labored breaths that matched the rhythm of Bruno's constant panting. My grandmother, Constance, treated Bruno like the son she never had, feeding him raw meat by hand while crooning disturbing lullabies in a voice that made my skin crawl. She would ask Bruno if he wanted another piece of bleeding steak in that sickening baby voice, answering herself that yes, of course he did. He was such a good boy, such a perfect boy. Meanwhile, I spent every waking moment calculating escape routes and safe hiding spots throughout that cursed house. The adults never witnessed Bruno's true nature. Their blindness to his malevolence was absolute and terrifying. How could they not see what was happening right in front of them? How could they miss the calculated intelligence burning behind those yellow eyes, the way his lips would curl into something resembling a human smirk when he thought no one was watching? The first time I understood that something fundamentally wrong existed within Bruno's skull, I was barely 5 years old. I was sprawled across the kitchen linoleum with my coloring books while my grandmother prepared what she generously called lunch. Bruno lay beneath the scratched wooden table, supposedly sleeping off his morning meal of God knows what. I accidentally dropped my red crayon, the one I was using to color a fire truck, and when I reached down to retrieve it, Bruno's eyes snapped open with mechanical precision. Those weren't the warm, dopey eyes of a normal dog. They were completely focused, calculating, almost human in their malicious intelligence. He didn't growl or bare his yellowed teeth. That would have been easier to explain to the adults who insisted on treating him like a beloved family member. Instead, he simply stared at me with those cold, predatory eyes, and I swear to God he smiled. Not the happy, tongue-lolling grin that people mistake for canine joy, but something knowing and cruel and hungry. His black lips pulled back just enough to reveal the tips of his canine teeth, and his eyes narrowed with what I can only describe as amusement. It was the look of something that understood exactly how vulnerable I was, how completely at his mercy I remained. I yanked my hand back so violently that I struck my knuckles against the table leg hard enough to draw blood. The sharp pain barely registered through my terror. When I tried to explain what happened to my grandmother, she laughed it off with that dismissive chuckle adults use when children report things that don't fit their comfortable worldview. She insisted that Bruno adored children and was probably just playing with me, being friendly. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decade of my life. Whenever adults were present, Bruno performed his role as the perfect family pet with Academy Award-worthy precision. The moment they turned away, even for seconds, he transformed into something else entirely, something that watched and waited and planned with frightening intelligence. My grandfather constantly bragged about Bruno to anyone who would listen, claiming he was the smartest dog he'd ever encountered. He would often remark, with obvious pride, that sometimes he believed Bruno understood every word of human conversation. My grandmother was equally deluded, hand-feeding him chunks of raw meat while speaking to him in that nauseating baby voice that made my stomach turn. I learned quickly that the adults would never believe me about Bruno's behavior. After all, he was such a good dog, so well-trained, so intelligent. When I was 7, I was playing alone in the backyard while my grandparents tended their withering garden. I had this plastic action figure, a superhero whose name escapes me now, that I'd received for my birthday. I set the toy down for maybe 30 seconds to retie my sneaker. When I looked up, Bruno was standing directly over my action figure, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the bright plastic colors. He stared directly into my eyes with that same calculating expression I'd learned to fear, then slowly, deliberately picked up the toy in his massive jaws. The sound of plastic cracking between his teeth was obscenely loud in the afternoon silence. He applied pressure gradually, methodically, like someone carefully breaking each bone in a small animal. The action figure's arms snapped first, then the legs, then the torso crumpled with a sickening crunch. Throughout this destruction, Bruno never broke eye contact with me. His tail wagged in slow, deliberate sweeps, like a metronome keeping time with my increasing terror. When he finished destroying my toy, he dropped the mangled remains at my feet with ceremonial precision, then walked away with his tail high and his step jaunty, as if he'd accomplished something worth celebrating. The mutilated plastic looked like the remains of something that had been alive, something that had suffered. When I ran crying to my grandmother, she scolded me for leaving my toys where poor Bruno could mistake them for his own playthings. My grandfather handed me 5 crumpled dollar bills and told me to be more careful next time, to think about how confusing it must be for a dog to see unfamiliar objects in his territory. Their complete inability to see what was happening felt like a form of madness. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining things that weren't there? But the destroyed toy in my hands was real enough, and the memory of Bruno's calculating smile burned behind my eyelids every time I tried to sleep. The worst incident occurred when I was 9 years old, during a particularly dark October weekend. I was sleeping in the guest room at the end of the upstairs hallway. A room that always smelled like dust and old death, where the wallpaper peeled in long strips that resembled diseased skin. I woke around midnight with my bladder demanding attention. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel into hell, dark and seemingly endless. I didn't want to wake anyone by turning on lights, so I crept toward the bathroom using the faint moonlight filtering through grimy windows. Halfway down the hall, I heard the familiar click of nails on hardwood. Bruno materialized at the far end of the corridor, just a hulking silhouette against the lesser darkness. He stood perfectly motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Something about his posture was wrong, unnatural. He wasn't standing like a normal dog. He was too still, too purposeful, like a predator that had caught the scent of wounded prey. I took one step backward toward my room, and he took one step forward. I stepped back again, and he mirrored my movement exactly. It was like some twisted dance, some perverse game where the rules were written in my terror and his amusement. His breathing was audible now, deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that sounded almost human. When I finally turned to run back to my room, I heard him coming after me. Not the clumsy gallop of an excited dog, but measured, calculated steps that seemed to match my own panicked rhythm. I barely made it through my door before slamming it shut and turning the lock with shaking fingers. Bruno hit the door with tremendous force, making the entire frame shudder. Then came silence, the kind of complete quiet that feels more threatening than any sound. I stood there trembling, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Then I heard it, scratching at the door. Not the frantic clawing of a dog that wanted inside, but deliberate, methodical gouging. The sound was rhythmic, almost artistic, as if he was carving something meaningful into the wood. It continued for nearly 2 hours before stopping. In the morning, there were deep gouges in the bottom of the door, not random scratches, but deliberate marks that almost looked like letters or symbols. My grandfather examined the damage with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger at his precious dog, but something closer to fear. For the first time, I saw doubt in an adult's eyes when they looked at Bruno. My grandfather stared at those scratches for a long time, then at Bruno, then back at the scratches. He mumbled something about this not being like Bruno at all, about never seeing behavior like this before. But there was something in his voice, something that suggested maybe he had seen things he couldn't explain. When I was 11, Bruno died, and I wish I could claim to feel anything other than overwhelming relief. I was staying with my grandparents that particular weekend when it happened, and Bruno had been acting stranger than usual all day, more aggressive, more unpredictable. He'd spent hours pacing through the house, his nails clicking incessantly on the hardwood floors like some demented percussion instrument. He would stop randomly in doorways, staring at empty spaces as if he could see things the rest of us couldn't. His growling was constant and low, directed at shadows and corners where nothing visible lurked. That night, his behavior escalated to the point where my grandfather had to physically drag him to the basement and lock him in. Even through the thick wooden door and down a full flight of stairs, we could hear Bruno's barking. Not normal dog barking, but something that sounded almost like screaming. The sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent and terrible. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to complete silence. The kind of absolute quiet that feels wrong when you're accustomed to the normal creaks and sighs of an old house. I lay there in the darkness, suddenly aware that I couldn't hear Bruno anymore. No barking, no pacing, no scratching, nothing. The silence was somehow more terrifying than his noise had been. It felt heavy and expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pulled my blankets over my head and tried to convince myself that Bruno had simply tired himself out and fallen asleep. In the morning, my grandfather found him at the bottom of the basement stairs, dead. The veterinarian later determined it was a massive heart attack, apparently common for his age and breed. Natural causes, nothing suspicious, case closed. But what the veterinarian didn't see, what my grandmother quickly ushered me away from before I could examine too closely, was Bruno's expression. His lips were pulled back in what looked like a snarl of pure rage, his eyes wide open and staring at something only he could see. His front paws were extended as if he'd been reaching for something at the moment of death. He didn't look peaceful. He didn't look like he'd simply succumbed to age and genetics. He looked furious, cheated, as if death had interrupted something important he'd been planning to accomplish. I thought that would be the end of Bruno's reign of terror. I was catastrophically wrong. 3 months after Bruno's death, I arrived for another weekend visit to discover something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, positioned near my grandfather's favorite leather armchair in the den, was Bruno, stuffed and mounted in a standing position that captured him at his most intimidating. The taxidermist had done exceptional work. Bruno's fur had been expertly groomed and positioned, his posture regal and alert, exactly like in those competition photographs that still lined the basement walls. His mouth was slightly open, revealing those yellowed canine teeth that had haunted my nightmares for years. But something was wrong with his eyes. They were glass, obviously artificial, but they seemed to track movement around the room. No matter where I stood, those dead eyes followed me with the same calculating intelligence I remembered from life. The taxidermist had somehow captured the essence of Bruno's malevolent personality and trapped it behind those glassy windows. My grandfather beamed with pride as he asked if I thought Bruno looked magnificent. He explained that now Bruno would always be with them, watching over the family, protecting the house. My grandmother seemed less enthusiastic about the arrangement, but she supported her husband's decision with the kind of resigned acceptance that comes after decades of marriage. She explained quietly that my grandfather couldn't bear to part with Bruno, that this was his way of processing grief. But there was something in her voice, something that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with having a dead dog standing guard in their living room. That night was the first time I experienced what would become a terrifying pattern. I was reading in bed when I heard it, the familiar click of nails on hardwood in the hallway outside my room. The same measured rhythm, the same deliberate pace that had terrorized me for years. My door, which I was certain I'd closed and locked, stood slightly ajar. Through that gap, I could see nothing but darkness, but I felt something watching me with predatory patience. I sat paralyzed, staring at that opening, certain I would see Bruno's face appear in the shadows. Nothing materialized, but the feeling of being observed was overwhelming. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty. I looked down the stairs toward the den, where I could see Bruno's taxidermied form in the dim light, exactly where it had been earlier, unchanging, motionless, dead. I barricaded my door with a chair and barely slept that night. In the morning, I found small, dusty paw prints on the hardwood outside my room, prints that looked exactly like Bruno's, but that was impossible. When I showed my grandmother, she frowned and muttered something about the neighbor's cat somehow getting inside, but we both knew the neighbors didn't have pets. Over the next 2 years, my weekend visits became exercises in psychological torture. Objects would move around the house, usually my belongings, displaced or hidden in locations where I'd never left them. I'd find my backpack unzipped, homework scattered across floors like confetti. My clothes would be pulled from drawers and arranged in strange patterns that almost looked deliberate. Once I discovered my sneaker in the backyard garden, chewed beyond recognition and covered in fresh saliva that couldn't be explained. The shoe looked like it had been savaged by something with powerful jaws and a taste for destruction. The taxidermied Bruno never seemed to move. At least, I never caught him in the act. But sometimes I'd enter the den and find him facing a different direction than I remembered. When I'd mention this to my grandparents, they'd insist nothing had changed, that my memory was playing tricks on me. The incidents escalated gradually, systematically, like a carefully planned campaign of terror. I'd wake up to find my blankets pulled off during the night, scattered on the floor as if something had been searching underneath them. I'd feel pressure at the foot of my bed, like a large animal settling down to sleep, but nothing was ever there when I turned on the lights. The clicking of nails became a regular nighttime occurrence, always stopping just outside my door. Sometimes I could hear breathing, deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that sounded too measured to be natural. On particularly bad nights, I could hear what sounded like scratching inside the walls, as if something was trying to claw its way out from within the house's structure. My parents thought I was having behavioral problems. My grandparents were concerned but helpless. They never experienced anything themselves, which made my reports sound like the fantasies of an unstable child. My grandfather would suggest that maybe the old house was just settling, but I could tell he was troubled by something he couldn't articulate. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the taxidermied Bruno with an expression of uncertainty, as if he was beginning to question the wisdom of preserving his beloved pet. There were moments when he seemed to be listening to sounds only he could hear, his head tilted and his eyes distant. The final incident happened when I was 14, during what I promised myself would be my last overnight stay at that cursed house. It was spring break of 2003, and my grandparents had gone to bed early, leaving me alone with the television and my growing dread. I must have dozed off on the living room couch because I woke suddenly around midnight to find the television still broadcasting some late-night talk show. I had that unmistakable feeling of being watched, that primitive awareness that predators instill in their prey. The taxidermied Bruno was gone from his usual position near my grandfather's chair. The empty space where he'd stood seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I sat up fully, my heart racing as I scanned the dark room. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe my grandfather had moved him for cleaning, or perhaps the mounting had finally given way. But deep in my bones, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was happening, something that defied every logical explanation I could construct. I decided to retreat to my room upstairs, moving as quietly as possible through the house that seemed to breathe around me. Each step on the old staircase seemed to echo louder than it should have, as if the house itself was announcing my presence to whatever lurked in the shadows. When I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it, the clicking of nails on hardwood coming from my room. Not the remembered echo of past terror, but immediate, present, real. I should have run to my grandparents' room, should have screamed for help, but fear paralyzed my legs and stole my voice. I approached my bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar, and pushed it open with a trembling hand. There, in the center of my room, was Bruno. Not the stiff, artificial construct of the taxidermist, but something else entirely, something that defied every natural law I'd been taught to trust. He looked solid, but somehow wrong, like a photograph that had been poorly developed. His fur was dull and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His movements were jerky and unnatural, but his eyes, those yellow, calculating eyes, were exactly as I remembered them from life, burning with malicious intelligence and patient hunger. When he saw me, his mouth opened in what could only be described as a smile, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white in the darkness. The expression was so human, so deliberately cruel, that my mind recoiled from processing what I was seeing. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch in paralyzed terror as he slowly approached me, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor with each deliberate step. When he was directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the musty odor of death and preservation chemicals, he stopped. For a moment that lasted an eternity. Nothing happened. We stared at each other across the impossible gap between life and death, between sanity and madness. Then, faster than thought, he lunged forward and seized a mouthful of my hair in his jaws. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but it also broke the spell of terror that had held me motionless. I screamed as Bruno began dragging me by my hair toward the hallway, his supernatural strength easily overcoming my desperate struggles. I clawed at the doorframe, trying to grab onto something, anything that might anchor me to safety. My screams finally penetrated the thick walls and woke my grandparents. I heard their bedroom door slam open and their frantic footsteps in the hallway. My grandfather's voice called out, asking what was happening, then stopped mid-sentence as he rounded the corner and saw what was occurring. The moment the hallway light blazed on, Bruno vanished. Not ran away, not released me and fled, simply ceased to exist, as if he'd been nothing more than a shadow that couldn't survive illumination. 1 second he was there, solid and real and terrifying, gripping my hair with supernatural strength. The next second I was alone, collapsed on the floor, and sobbing uncontrollably. My grandmother helped me to my feet while my grandfather stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the empty space where Bruno had been. His face was completely drained of color, his eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from having your fundamental understanding of reality shattered. I asked him through my tears if he had seen it too, if I wasn't going insane. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper as he admitted that he had seen something that shouldn't have been possible. That night, while I lay trembling in my grandparents' bed, there was no way I was sleeping alone. I heard my grandfather go downstairs. There was silence for a long time, then the sound of the back door opening and closing. Heavy footsteps crossed the backyard, followed by the distinctive sound of a shovel biting into earth. In the morning, the taxidermied Bruno was gone. My grandfather refused to tell me exactly what he'd done with it, only saying that it had been taken care of, that some things shouldn't be preserved, that some doors, once opened, are difficult to close. He finally admitted that he'd been experiencing things too. Objects moved, strange noises, a persistent feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. He'd dismissed it all, convinced it was just grief and imagination playing tricks on his aging mind. I never stayed overnight at my grandparents' house again. My parents didn't understand my refusal, but they respected it after seeing the genuine terror in my eyes whenever the subject was mentioned. Years later, after both my grandparents had passed away and we were cleaning out their house, I found a small metal box buried in the backyard garden under an unmarked stone. Inside was a dog collar, worn and faded, with the name Bruno barely visible on the tarnished tag. Next to it was a note in my grandfather's shaking handwriting. Some doors, once opened, are hard to close. Some love becomes something else in the dark. May God forgive me for what I tried to keep. I reburied the box exactly where I found it and never told anyone about the discovery. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I still sometimes wake in the night to the phantom sound of nails clicking on hardwood, and I know that somewhere, in the space between life and death, Bruno is still hunting. But as long as his remains stay buried and forgotten, as long as no one else tries to preserve what should be allowed to die, I think the door will remain closed. The house in Millfield was eventually demolished. The new owners complained of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena, but they attributed it to the age of the structure. When the bulldozers finally came, I felt something that might have been relief. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if destroying the house was enough. I wonder if some forms of love, twisted by grief and denial, can survive even the destruction of their earthly anchors. I wonder, and I try not to listen too carefully to the sounds outside my bedroom door. I was 16, a sophomore at Lincoln High back in 2012, and absolutely nothing about me screamed cool kid. Neither did my best friend Danny. We'd been inseparable since kindergarten, two socially awkward kids who found refuge in anime, video games, and our shared inability to talk to girls without our voices cracking. Danny came over every weekend without fail, and we'd lose ourselves in whatever new series we'd discovered or spend hours grinding levels in whatever RPG had caught our attention. That particular Friday in October, we were huddled around my laptop in the computer lab during lunch period. Danny had been bragging all week about some premium content he'd gotten from a Discord server. Rare anime episodes, exclusive manga chapters, the kind of stuff that made us feel like we were part of some secret club. I watched him navigate through folders with names like Ultra Rare and Limited Edition, my curiosity growing with each click. "Dude, check this out," Danny whispered, his fingers hovering over a folder labeled Premium Content. His eyes had that mischievous glint that usually meant trouble, but I leaned in anyway. The folder opened to reveal dozens of files with suggestive thumbnails and titles that made my face burn red. It wasn't anything too extreme by internet standards, but for two sheltered 16-year-olds it might as well have been contraband. We were so absorbed in our discovery that we didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching behind us. Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through our whispered excitement like a blade. "What exactly are you two looking at?" The entire computer lab fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward us as Danny frantically tried to close the browser windows, his mouse clicking wildly as more inappropriate images flashed across the screen. Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted from curiosity to disgust to stern disapproval in the span of 3 seconds. My stomach dropped so fast, I thought I might actually throw up right there on the keyboard. "Principal's office. Now," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. The walk to the principal's office felt like a death march. with students in the hallway staring and whispering as we passed. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, and Danny looked like he was about to cry. Principal Rodriguez didn't waste time with pleasantries. Within an hour, both sets of parents had been called. The conversation was brief, clinical, and mortifying. Words like inappropriate material and serious violation of school policy echoed in my ears as I sat there wanting to disappear into the floor. Dad picked me up in his old pickup truck, and the silence during the drive home was suffocating. I could feel his disappointment radiating from the driver's seat like heat from a furnace. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he sat there for a long moment with the engine running, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. "I talked to Mr. Stevens," he finally said, referring to Danny's father. "You boys have two options. You can be grounded for a month, no internet, no games, no leaving the house except for school. Or you can come hunting with me this weekend." He turned to look at me, his gray eyes serious. "Your choice, but you're both getting the same punishment." That night, Danny and I texted back and forth for hours, weighing our options. A month without internet felt like a death sentence, but hunting wasn't exactly appealing either. Neither of us had ever been hunting before, and the idea of killing animals made us both uncomfortable. But Dad had been trying to get me to go hunting with him for years, always saying it would make a man out of me or teach me about the real world. I'd always found excuses to avoid it. "At least we'd be outside doing something," Danny texted. "Better than being locked up like prisoners." "Yeah, and it's only one weekend," I replied. "How bad could it be?" Looking back now, I realized that was probably the last normal conversation Danny and I would ever have. Friday after school, Dad picked both of us up in his truck, the back loaded with hunting gear and supplies. The drive to his cabin in northern Michigan took nearly 4 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until we were surrounded by nothing but dense forest and the occasional rundown gas station. The further we drove, the more excited Dad became, humming along to classic rock on the radio and pointing out landmarks from his own childhood hunting trips. "You boys are going to love this," he said for the 10th time, glancing at us in the rearview mirror. "Nothing like being out in nature, away from all those computers and video games. This'll put some hair on your chest." Danny and I exchanged a look that said everything. This was going to be a long weekend. The cabin sat in a small clearing about a mile off the main road, accessible only by a rutted dirt path that made the truck bounce and groan with every pothole. It was smaller than I'd expected, just 2 rooms and a loft, built from logs that had darkened with age and weather. The interior smelled like pine needles, old coffee, and something else. Something earthy and organic that I couldn't quite identify. Dad spent the first hour giving us a comprehensive tour of his hunting equipment, laying everything out on the small kitchen table like a military inspection. Rifles, ammunition, hunting knives with worn leather handles, camouflage clothing that smelled like mothballs, bright orange safety vests, compasses, and first aid supplies. Each item came with a detailed explanation of its purpose and a stern lecture about safety. "Rule number 1, Dad said, holding up his index finger. Never point a gun at anything unless you intend to shoot it. Rule number 2, always identify your target before you shoot. Rule number 3, stay within sight of each other at all times. These woods can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." The way he said dangerous made something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. Dad had been hunting these woods for 20 years. If anyone knew how to stay safe out here, it was him. We heated up canned beef stew for dinner, eating by lamplight since the cabin had no electricity. The silence outside was absolute. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the occasional crack of settling wood and the distant hoot of an owl. Dad regaled us with hunting stories from his youth, his eyes bright with enthusiasm in the flickering lamplight. "We'll be up at 4, he announced as we prepared for bed. "Deer are most active at dawn and dusk. You'll see. There's nothing like watching the forest wake up." Danny climbed into the top bunk while I took the bottom, but neither of us could fall asleep. Every sound outside seemed amplified in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the scratch of something small scurrying across the roof. The woods were alive with sounds I couldn't identify, and my imagination began filling in the blanks with creatures and scenarios that made my heart race. "You awake?" Danny whispered from above. "Yeah. This place is creepy as hell." "Tell me about it." What do you think is making all that noise? Probably just animals, raccoons or whatever. But even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. There was something about the sounds that seemed wrong somehow, too deliberate, too organized, like something was moving through the forest with purpose. I must have finally drifted off around midnight, because the next thing I knew, Dad was shaking me awake in what felt like the middle of the night. 4 in the morning came like a slap to the face. Dad was already dressed and making coffee and oatmeal by the light of his camping lantern, moving around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. Outside, the world was still black as pitch, with only the faintest hint of gray on the eastern horizon. "Rise and shine, boys," Dad said cheerfully, as if getting up before dawn was the most natural thing in the world. Early bird gets the worm, and the early hunter gets the deer. Danny and I stumbled around in the darkness, struggling into our borrowed camouflage clothing and trying to wake up enough to function. The hunting gear felt foreign and uncomfortable. The jacket was too big, the boots too heavy, and the orange safety vest made me feel like a construction worker. Dad checked our rifles one more time, walking us through the loading and safety procedures with military precision. "Remember," he said, his voice serious in the pre-dawn darkness, "we're hunting deer, nothing else. If you see anything that isn't a deer, you don't shoot, understood?" We nodded, though I wondered what else we might encounter out here that would require such a specific warning. The hike into the woods was surreal, our flashlight beams creating small pools of light in an ocean of darkness. The air was crisp and cold, our breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Dew soaked through my boots within minutes, and I could feel the moisture seeping into my socks. Every step seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs echoing through the trees. We walked for nearly an hour, following what Dad called game trails, paths through the forest that were invisible to my untrained eyes but apparently obvious to him. The trees grew denser as we moved deeper into the woods, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out even the faint starlight. Finally, Dad stopped in a small clearing and began setting up what he called a blind, a camouflaged shelter where we could wait for deer to appear. The structure was simple but effective, providing concealment while giving us a clear view of the surrounding area. "This is where patience comes in," Dad whispered as we settled in to wait. "Hunting is 90% waiting and 10% action. The key is to stay quiet and alert." As the sun began to rise, the forest gradually came alive around us. The darkness retreated slowly, revealing details that had been hidden in the night. Trees took shape, their bark textured and varied. Undergrowth became visible, thick with ferns and fallen logs. Birds began to sing, their voices creating a natural symphony that was both beautiful and slightly unsettling. But as the morning progressed, I began to notice something odd. The birds that had been singing so enthusiastically at dawn gradually fell silent. At first, I thought it was just the natural progression of morning activities, but the silence seemed to spread through the forest like a wave, starting from somewhere deeper in the woods and moving toward us. Danny noticed it too. He kept shifting in his position, looking around nervously and opening his mouth as if to say something before Dad's stern looks reminded him to stay quiet. But even Dad seemed to sense that something had changed. His relaxed posture became more alert, and his eyes scanned the tree line with increased intensity. By 8 o'clock, we still hadn't seen any deer, and the forest had become unnaturally quiet. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like the entire woods were holding their breath. "Let's move to another spot," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. Sometimes the deer change their patterns. We packed up our minimal gear and began moving deeper into the forest, following another of Dad's invisible trails. The trees grew even denser here, their branches interlocking overhead to create a natural tunnel. Less light filtered through the canopy, and the air felt cooler, almost damp. That's when Dad suddenly stopped, his entire body going rigid. He held up his hand for silence and pointed ahead through the trees. At first, I couldn't see anything unusual, just more forest, more shadows, more undergrowth. But then I noticed movement about 50 yards ahead, small shapes moving between the trees with an odd, jerky motion. Dad motioned for us to get down, and we crouched behind a fallen log. He pulled out his binoculars and studied the area for what felt like an eternity. his face growing increasingly tense. When he finally lowered the binoculars, his expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. A mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Tell me what you see," he whispered, handing me the binoculars. Through the binoculars, the distant figures came into sharp focus, and my blood seemed to freeze in my veins. 3 small shapes moved between the trees, no more than 3 feet tall, but they definitely weren't children. Their movements were all wrong. Too stiff, too angular, like marionettes being operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with a sickly gray undertone that made them look diseased. They appeared to be naked, but their bodies were somehow wrong, proportioned in a way that hurt to look at. Their limbs were too long for their torsos, their heads too large for their necks. They moved in perfect synchronization, bending down to collect something from the forest floor before straightening up and moving to the next location. Whatever they were gathering, they placed it in small sacks or pouches that seemed to be made from some kind of organic material. The most disturbing thing was their faces. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't make out distinct features, just dark hollows where eyes should be and holes that might have been mouths. When they turned their heads, which they did frequently, the motion was too fast, too sharp, like birds of prey scanning for threats. I felt Danny nudging me urgently, and I reluctantly handed him the binoculars. His sharp intake of breath told me he was seeing the same impossible things I had witnessed. When he tried to whisper, "What the hell?" Dad immediately motioned for complete silence, his face grave with concern. I looked at my father, this man who had always been my anchor of normalcy and strength, and saw genuine fear in his eyes for the first time in my life. He'd been hunting these woods for 20 years, knew every trail and landmark, every type of wildlife that called this forest home. Whatever those things were, they weren't part of his familiar world. "What are they?" I mouthed silently. Dad shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the distant figures. He took the binoculars back and studied them for another long moment before whispering so quietly I could barely hear him. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this." The 3 creatures continued their methodical collection, moving through the underbrush with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this many times before. They communicated with each other, but not with sounds. Instead, they used quick, jerky gestures that looked almost like sign language. Occasionally, one would pause and tilt its oversized head, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Danny was breathing heavily beside me, and I could see him struggling not to panic. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking as he gripped his rifle. I reached over and touched his arm, trying to provide some comfort, but I was just as terrified as he was. That's when Danny made the mistake that changed everything. In his nervousness, he shifted his weight too quickly and lost his balance. His elbow caught on a protruding root, sending him tumbling backward with a crash that echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. His rifle hit the ground with a metallic clang that seemed to reverberate forever. The effect on the 3 creatures was immediate and terrifying. They stopped moving instantly, their heads snapping toward our location with that same unnaturally fast motion. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel them focusing their attention on us, like the weight of their gaze was a physical force pressing against my chest. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the forest floor. The creatures remained perfectly still, their dark eye hollows fixed on our hiding spot. Dad's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I could see his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, all 3 creatures began moving toward us. Not running, not rushing, but walking with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Their movements were purposeful and coordinated, like hunters who had just spotted their prey. "Run," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run now." We exploded from our hiding spot like startled deer, crashing through the underbrush without any regard for stealth or safety. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our faces as we fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, I could hear Dad shouting instructions, but his words were lost in the thunder of our panic and the sound of breaking branches. Danny stumbled again, going down hard and crying out as he hit the ground. Dad stopped to help him while I kept running, my mind blank with terror. Every shadow looked like a pursuing figure. Every movement in my peripheral vision made my heart race faster. "Keep going," Dad's voice echoed behind me. "Get back to the cabin. We'll catch up." I hesitated for just a moment, torn between loyalty to my friend and the overwhelming need to escape. But Dad's voice carried an authority I'd never heard before, a command that brooked no argument. "Go!" So I ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping across my face and thorns tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned with the effort of running, and my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Every sound behind me, every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, convinced me that those things were gaining ground. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction. The trails that Dad had followed so confidently were invisible to me, and every tree looked the same. Panic made it impossible to think clearly, to remember the landmarks we'd passed on the way in. All I could do was run and hope that instinct would guide me back to safety. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I burst through the tree line into the familiar clearing where the cabin sat. I'd never been so relieved to see that small, weathered building. My legs gave out as I reached the front door, and I collapsed against it, gasping for air and shaking uncontrollably. It took several minutes before I could steady my hands enough to work the door handle. Once inside, I immediately locked the door behind me and grabbed Dad's shotgun from the rack above the fireplace. My fingers fumbled with the shells as I tried to load it, dropping several on the floor in my haste. The simple mechanical action of loading the weapon helped calm my nerves slightly, giving my hands something to do while my mind raced. I positioned myself facing the door and window, the shotgun across my knees, and waited. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every sound outside, the whisper of wind through the trees, the creak of settling wood, the distant call of a bird, made me jump and tighten my grip on the weapon. 1 hour passed, then another. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. Where were Dad and Danny? What had happened after I ran? The possibilities that ran through my mind were too terrible to contemplate, but I couldn't stop imagining the worst. As afternoon faded into evening, I heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps that sounded human, but somehow wrong. I raised the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger, and held my breath. 3 knocks echoed through the small cabin. "Son, it's us," came Dad's voice through the door. "Open up." Relief flooded through me so intensely that I almost cried, but something made me hesitate. There was something about Dad's voice that didn't sound quite right. It was flatter than usual, lacking the warmth and inflection I was used to. It sounded like someone doing an impression of my father. "Dad?" I called back, not moving from my position. "Yes," came the reply. "Open the door. Danny's hurt." I moved to the window and peered out carefully. There they were, Dad and Danny standing on the small porch, looking perfectly normal. Dad was wearing the same hunting clothes he'd put on that morning, and Danny was standing upright, apparently uninjured, despite the claim that he was hurt. But something was wrong with the way they stood. Too straight, too still, like soldiers at attention. And Danny wasn't looking at the cabin. His gaze was fixed on some point in the distance, his expression blank and vacant. "What happened out there?" I called through the door, still not moving to unlock it. "We'll explain inside," Dad replied in that same flat tone. "Open the door." "Danny, are you okay?" I asked directly. Danny's head turned toward the sound of my voice, but his movement was too sharp, too quick, exactly like the motions of those creatures in the forest. When our eyes met through the window, there was no recognition in his gaze, no spark of the friendship we'd shared for 11 years. His eyes were empty, like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. But they were my father and my best friend. Whatever had happened in the woods, whatever had frightened us so badly, they were here now, and they were alive. That had to count for something. Slowly, reluctantly, I unlocked the door. Dad and Danny entered the cabin with movements that were subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Dad walked too stiffly, his usual casual stride replaced by something mechanical and precise, Danny moved like he was concentrating on each step, as if walking had become something that required conscious thought rather than instinct. The first thing Dad did was take the shotgun from my hands. "Don't need this now," he said, his voice carrying that same flat quality I'd noticed through the door. There was no warmth in it, no relief at our reunion, no acknowledgement of the terror we'd all experienced in the woods. Danny sat heavily on the small couch, his gaze fixed on the floor. His clothes were dirty and torn, consistent with our panicked flight through the forest, but there were no visible injuries, no cuts, no bruises, nothing to explain why Dad had claimed he was hurt. "What happened after I left?" I asked, settling into the chair across from them. "Those things in the woods, what were they?" Dad began packing our gear with methodical efficiency, folding clothes and organizing equipment as if we were checking out of a hotel. "What things?" he asked without looking up. The question hit me like a physical blow. "The creatures we saw, the small ones collecting stuff from the forest floor. We all saw them through the binoculars." "We didn't see anything," Dad replied, his voice emotionless. "There was a bear. We ran, that's all." I stared at him in disbelief. A bear? That was his explanation for what we'd witnessed? "Dad, that's not what happened. Those things weren't bears. They were—" "We're leaving now," Dad interrupted, cutting off my protests. He continued packing with the same mechanical precision, never pausing to look at me or acknowledge what I was saying. I turned to Danny, desperate for support, for someone to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. "Danny, tell him. You saw them too. You looked through the binoculars." Danny finally raised his head to meet my gaze, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach lurch. There was no recognition there, no memory of our shared experience, no acknowledgement of our lifelong friendship. When he spoke, his voice had the same flat quality as Dad's. "Your father's right," he said slowly, as if each word required effort. "It was just a bear." But even as he said it, I could see his hands trembling slightly, and there was something in his expression. Fear, maybe, or a desperate plea for me to stop asking questions. His eyes seemed to be trying to communicate something his words couldn't say. The drive home was a nightmare of silence and tension. Dad drove with the same mechanical precision he'd shown while packing, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Danny sat beside me in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Every attempt I made at conversation was met with monosyllabic responses or complete silence. When we dropped Danny off at his house, I expected some acknowledgement of our friendship, some promise to talk later about what had really happened. Instead, he got out of the truck without a word, walking toward his front door with that same stiff, unnatural gait. "Danny," I called after him through the window, "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" He paused at his front door and turned back toward me. For just a moment, his expression seemed to flicker, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been the real Danny trying to communicate. But then his face went blank again, and he nodded once before disappearing into his house. At home, Mom was waiting in the kitchen with dinner prepared and questions about our hunting trip. Dad's response was brief and emotionless. "Fine." He headed straight for the basement, and I could hear him moving around down there for hours, doing something that involved a lot of heavy lifting and what sounded like construction. That night, lying in my bed and staring at the ceiling, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind wanted to accept Dad's explanation. Maybe the stress and fear had made us see things that weren't there. Maybe it really had been just a bear, and our imaginations had filled in the terrifying details. But I couldn't shake the memory of those pale, wrong-shaped figures moving through the forest with such purpose. I couldn't forget the way they'd all turned toward us when Danny made noise, or the way they'd begun approaching us with that coordinated, predatory movement. And I couldn't ignore the fact that both Dad and Danny had returned fundamentally changed, as if something essential had been removed from them and replaced with a hollow imitation. Danny didn't call the next day or the day after that. When I finally worked up the courage to call him, his mother answered and said he was sleeping, that he'd been very tired since the hunting trip. The third time I called, she said he wasn't feeling well and couldn't come to the phone. When I saw him at school the following Monday, it was like looking at a stranger wearing Danny's face. Danny's transformation became more apparent with each passing day at school. He moved through the hallways like he was navigating an unfamiliar maze, pausing at intersections and staring at familiar faces as if he couldn't quite remember who they were. Our shared interests, anime, video games, the inside jokes that had sustained our friendship for years, seemed to have been wiped from his memory completely. During lunch, I cornered him at his usual table in the cafeteria. "Dude, we need to talk about what happened in the woods," I said, keeping my voice low. "Something's wrong with you, and something's wrong with my dad." Danny looked at me with those empty eyes, chewing his sandwich with mechanical precision. "Nothing happened in the woods," he said in that same flat tone that had become his default mode of communication. "We saw a bear. We ran. End of story." "Stop lying," I hissed, frustration boiling over. "We've been best friends since we were 5 years old. You can't just pretend that those things we saw weren't real." For just a moment, something flickered across Danny's face, a brief crack in the facade that revealed the terror lurking beneath. His hand started to shake, and he dropped his sandwich onto the table. When he looked at me, I could see the real Danny trapped behind those vacant eyes, struggling to communicate something his mouth couldn't say. "Drop it," he whispered, glancing around the cafeteria as if he expected to see something watching us. "For your own good, just drop it." That was the last real conversation we had. Danny started avoiding me after that, taking different routes through the hallways and sitting with different people at lunch. When I tried to approach him, he would walk away without a word. It was like watching my best friend die and be replaced by a hollow shell. A month later, Danny's parents transferred him to a private school across town. They said he needed a fresh start and that the public school environment wasn't right for him anymore. I never saw him again. Things at home deteriorated just as rapidly. Dad spent increasingly long periods in the basement, sometimes disappearing down there for entire days. He installed a heavy padlock on the basement door, and when I asked him about it, he just stared at me with those wrong eyes until I looked away. The sounds from the basement became a constant source of anxiety. I could hear him talking down there, but it sounded like he was having conversations with multiple people. The voices that responded didn't sound quite human. They were too high-pitched, too sharp, like the chirping of birds, but with an underlying intelligence that made my skin crawl. Mom noticed the changes too, though she tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. "Your father's just going through something," she told me one evening as we sat at the dinner table without him. "Men his age sometimes have difficulties adjusting to changes in their lives." But I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she glanced nervously toward the basement door whenever those strange sounds drifted upstairs. She'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. Dad's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped going to work, claiming he was taking a leave of absence to focus on important research. When his boss called the house looking for him, Dad would disappear into the basement and refuse to come out until the phone stopped ringing. He began taking long walks at night, leaving the house after we'd gone to bed and returning before dawn. I started staying awake to listen for his return, and the sounds he made coming back were wrong. His footsteps were too light, too quick, and sometimes I could swear I heard other footsteps accompanying his, smaller, quicker steps that didn't sound like they belonged to human feet. In the mornings, I would find evidence of his nocturnal activities, mud tracked through the kitchen that had an odd, organic smell unlike regular dirt, and small scratches on his arms and face that he couldn't or wouldn't explain. His clothes would be filthy and sometimes torn, as if he'd been crawling through underbrush or digging in the earth. The final straw came on a cold morning in December, 3 months after our hunting trip. I woke to the sound of screaming. I found Mom on the bathroom floor, her body convulsing as some invisible force seemed to be tearing through her nervous system. Dad stood in the doorway watching, his expression utterly blank, as if he were observing a mildly interesting television program rather than his wife's medical emergency. "Call 911!" I screamed at him as I knelt beside Mom, trying to remember what I'd learned about seizures in health class. But Dad just stood there, motionless, those wrong eyes fixed on Mom's writhing form with what might have been clinical curiosity. I called 911 myself, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to Dad's eerie passivity. They worked on Mom with practiced skill, checking her vital signs and asking questions that Dad answered in monosyllables. Stroke, one of the paramedics told me as they loaded Mom onto a stretcher. Severe one. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. I expected Dad to ride in the ambulance or at least follow us to the hospital, but he simply stood in the driveway and watched as we drove away. When I looked back through the rear window, he was still standing there, perfectly still, like a statue of a man rather than a living human being. Mom spent 2 weeks in the ICU, her brain activity monitored by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. The doctor said there had been massive damage, that even if she survived, she would likely never be the same. Dad visited exactly once, standing beside her bed for 5 minutes before leaving without a word. She died on a Tuesday morning while I was at school. Dad picked me up from the principal's office, delivered the news in that same flat tone he'd used for everything else, and drove us home in silence. At the funeral, he stood apart from everyone else, showing no emotion as they lowered Mom's casket into the ground. When people tried to offer their condolences, Dad would stare at them with those empty eyes until they became uncomfortable and walked away. Several family friends commented on how different he seemed, how the loss had changed him, if they only knew how right they were. The year and a half that followed were the worst of my life. Living alone with the thing that had replaced my father was like being trapped in a house with a barely functional robot that occasionally remembered it was supposed to pretend to be human. He rarely spoke, rarely ate, and spent almost all his time in that locked basement. Strange packages began arriving at irregular intervals, small boxes wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Dad would take them directly to the basement, and I would hear sounds down there that suggested he was opening them and distributing their contents to something. The organic smell that had always emanated from the basement grew stronger, accompanied by new odors that made me gag when they drifted upstairs. Sometimes I would find tiny footprints in the mud by the back door, footprints that were roughly human-shaped but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process them completely. They were too small to belong to an adult, but they had too many toes and the proportions were all wrong. Dad's physical transformation accelerated during this period. He lost weight rapidly, his skin taking on that same grayish, translucent quality I'd seen in the creatures in the forest. His movements became even more mechanical and precise, and sometimes I would catch him moving his head with that same sharp, bird-like motion that had terrified me in the woods. I counted down the days until my 18th birthday, with the desperate intensity of a prisoner awaiting parole. I applied to colleges as far from home as possible, eventually choosing a school in California that offered me a partial scholarship. Dad showed no interest in my plans, no emotion when I told him I was leaving. He simply nodded once and returned to whatever he was doing in the basement. On graduation day, Dad didn't attend the ceremony. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma with an empty chair where my father should have been sitting. That night, as I packed my belongings for the move to California, I could hear him in the basement having one of his conversations with those other voices. I left the next morning while he was on one of his nocturnal walks, unable to face another emotionless goodbye. I left a note on the kitchen table explaining that I was starting my new life and didn't know when I'd be back. Looking back at the house as I drove away, I realized I was probably seeing it for the last time. College was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life among people who didn't know about my strange family history. I made friends, joined clubs, and slowly began to feel human again. The nightmares came less frequently, and I started to believe that maybe I could leave the past behind. But I couldn't shake the need to know what had happened to Dad, what those things in the forest had been, and why Danny and I had been the only ones to see them. During winter break of my freshman year, I drove back to Michigan to collect the rest of my belongings and hopefully get some answers. The house looked abandoned when I pulled into the driveway. The grass was overgrown, newspapers and mail had piled up on the front porch, and several windows had been broken by storm damage that no one had bothered to repair. The neighbors said they hadn't seen Dad in months. Using my old key, I entered the house that no longer felt like home. The smell hit me immediately, that organic, earthy odor I remembered from the basement, but now it permeated the entire house. The furniture was covered in dust, and there were more of those strange footprints tracked across the floors. Dad's bedroom was completely empty. His clothes, his personal belongings, even his furniture. Everything was gone, as if he had simply evaporated. The only sign that he'd ever lived there was a thin layer of dust in the shape of a bed frame on the hardwood floor. Steeling myself for what I might find, I used the key hanging beside the basement door to unlock it for the first time. The basement was empty too, completely empty, except for a single piece of paper lying in the center of the concrete floor. I picked up the paper with trembling hands. Written in Dad's familiar handwriting were 3 words: "They are home." Below that, in a different handwriting, smaller, more angular, like the scratching of claws on paper, was a single line: "The cycle continues." That night, staying in a motel near the highway, I called the police to report Dad missing. They filed a report, but as the detective explained, adults have the right to disappear if they want to. They'd investigate if evidence of foul play emerged, but for now it was just another missing person case in a world full of people who walked away from their lives. I sold the house through a real estate attorney, never setting foot in it again. The buyers were a young couple with 2 small children who were excited about the rustic charm of the property. I wondered if they would notice the strange smells, the odd sounds that came from the basement, the footprints that appeared in the mud after certain kinds of rain. I never returned to my hometown after that, but sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself searching online for missing person reports from that area of Michigan. There have been several over the years, people who went into those woods and never came out, or who came out changed in ways their families couldn't explain. And sometimes, when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment in California, I can swear I hear the sound of small, quick footsteps moving through the darkness, accompanied by voices that are too high-pitched to be human, but too intelligent to be animal. The hunting trip was supposed to make men out of Danny and me. Instead, it showed us that there are things in this world that are better left undiscovered. Creatures that exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're capable of understanding. I'm 26 now, graduated from college, working a normal job, living a normal life. But every hunting season, when the leaves begin to turn and the air grows cold, I remember those pale figures moving through the forest with their jerky, purposeful gait. I remember Dad's empty eyes and Danny's terrified silence. And I wonder if somewhere in those Michigan woods, they're still out there, still collecting whatever it was they gathered from the forest floor, still waiting for the next group of hunters to stumble into their territory. The cycle continues, just like the note said. Some nights, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I wake up with the taste of pine needles in my mouth and the smell of that organic, earthy odor filling my nostrils. On those nights, I check all the locks on my doors and windows, and I remind myself that I'm hundreds of miles away from those woods. But I know, deep in my bones, that distance doesn't matter to creatures like that. They're patient, they're organized, and they remember everyone who has seen them. The hunting trip taught me that there are predators in this world far more dangerous than bears or wolves. The real predators walk upright, speak in whispers, and know how to wear the faces of the people we love. And once they've noticed you, once you've stumbled into their territory and witnessed their work, you become part of their collection. Maybe not right away, maybe not for years, but eventually, everyone comes home. The Granite Peak Trail was supposed to be a challenge, not a nightmare. My friend Darren had suggested the trip, a 5-day trek through one of the most remote sections of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. As an experienced hiker with over a decade of backcountry trips under my belt, I didn't think twice about accepting. Our group consisted of 4 people, myself, Darren, his cousin Josh, and Josh's girlfriend Melanie. We'd all hiked together before, though never on something this isolated. The Bitterroots have nearly 1.6 million acres of wilderness, and the northern section we'd chosen sees fewer than 50 hikers a year. Perfect spot to disappear if you wanted to, Josh had joked as we finalized our route. I remember laughing. We arrived at the trailhead on a Wednesday morning in early October. The parking area was empty except for our vehicle, a beaten-up Subaru Outback that had seen better days. Nobody else crazy enough to be out here this late in the season, Darren remarked, shouldering his pack. The temperature was forecasted to drop below freezing at night, but we were prepared with proper gear. The first signs of something off came within hours of starting our hike. About 3 miles in, we found unusual markings on several trees, not standard trailblazes, but deep parallel gouges about 6 feet up the trunks. They appeared too methodical to be from animal claws. Bear marking territory? Melanie suggested, examining one of the cuts. Bears don't mark this high, I replied, and not in straight lines like this. Probably some local hunters, Darren said dismissively. They use weird markers sometimes. We pressed on, making good time despite our heavy packs. By late afternoon, we'd covered 8 miles of steady incline, working our way deeper into the forest. The trail grew progressively narrower, with fewer signs of human passage. Pine needles crunched beneath our boots, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of decomposing leaves and damp earth. Our planned campsite was near a small mountain stream, according to our topographic maps. We reached it just before sunset, a small clearing surrounded by dense pines and firs, with the gentle sound of running water nearby. As we set up our tents, I noticed Josh studying the tree line with an unusual intensity. "What's up?" I asked. "Nothing," he said, still staring. "Just thought I saw something move out there." "Probably deer," I said. "They're curious creatures." "Yeah, probably." We gathered firewood and prepared dinner as darkness fell. The temperature dropped rapidly, and we huddled around the fire, swapping stories and passing a flask of whiskey. The forest around us came alive with night sounds, the rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then abruptly, everything went silent. The transition was so sudden that all 4 of us noticed at once, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. The forest had become completely still, as if holding its breath. Even the stream seemed to quiet. "That's weird," Melanie whispered, her voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "Probably a predator nearby," Darren said, though he didn't sound convinced. "When smaller animals sense a threat, they go quiet." We listened intently for several minutes, but heard nothing beyond the soft crackling of our fire. Eventually, the normal forest sounds gradually returned, but they seemed different somehow, more cautious, more restrained. That night, I awoke to the sound of movement outside my tent. Not the familiar rustling of nocturnal forest creatures, but deliberate bipedal steps circling our campsite. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The footsteps paused near my tent, and I could swear I heard breathing, deep, rhythmic, but not quite human. I reached for my flashlight, debating whether to investigate, when Darren's voice came from the neighboring tent. "Hello? Is someone out there?" The footsteps retreated rapidly into the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" I whispered across to Darren's tent. "Yeah," he replied. "Sounded like someone walking around." "I'm going to check it out," I said, unzipping my tent. The campsite was bathed in moonlight. Nothing moved in the surrounding trees, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Our backpacks, which we'd hung from a tree branch to keep away from animals, had been taken down. They now sat nearly arranged by our fire pit, the contents undisturbed but clearly examined. "Wake the others," I told Darren, who had emerged from his tent. "Someone's been through our stuff." Josh and Melanie joined us, and we surveyed the scene with growing unease. "Should we pack up and head back?" Melanie asked, hugging herself against the cold. "In the middle of the night?" Josh shook his head. "That's asking to get lost or injured." "We stick together until morning," I decided. 2-person watches until dawn. Then we decide. None of us slept much after that. During my watch with Darren, I spotted movement at the edge of our camp, just a shadow slipping between trees, there and gone so quickly, I couldn't be certain I'd seen anything at all. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" Darren replied, scanning the darkness. I hesitated. "Nothing, just my eyes playing tricks." But I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was watching us, and whatever it was getting bolder. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the forest floor. We debated returning to the trailhead, but ultimately decided to continue our planned route. The incident with our backpacks was concerning, but we rationalized it might have been caused by an unusually bold animal, perhaps a raccoon or even a black bear. "Let's just be more careful about securing our food and gear," Josh suggested. We broke camp efficiently, each of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had visited during the night. The day's hike would take us deeper into the wilderness, following the ridgeline up toward Granite Peak. According to our map, we'd make camp near an alpine lake about 9 miles ahead. The forest changed as we ascended. The thick pines gave way to sparser vegetation, and occasional clearings offered breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. By noon, we'd climbed nearly 2,000 feet in elevation. During a water break, I noticed something unusual about half a mile down the slope, a flash of unnatural color among the browns and greens of the forest. "Does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing. Darren pulled out his binoculars and focused. "Looks like fabric? Maybe a tent or backpack?" "Another hiker?" Melanie suggested hopefully. "Let's check it out," I said. "It's not far off our path." We descended carefully through the underbrush. As we got closer, I could see it was indeed a tent, or what remained of one. The once blue fabric was shredded and scattered across a small clearing, along with the contents of a backpack, clothing, a water filter, packages of freeze-dried food torn open and strewn about. "Jesus," Josh whispered, surveying the scene. "Bear attack?" I examined the damage more closely. "I don't think so. These tears are too clean, too deliberate." "Could be a mountain lion," Darren suggested, but he sounded doubtful. "Where's the hiker?" Melanie asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. We searched the area, calling out and listening for a response. About 30 yards from the destroyed campsite, we found a hiking boot, still laced, lying on its side. "This isn't good," I said, picking it up. The boot was a men's size 11, sturdy and well-worn. There was no blood or signs of struggle, just a single boot abandoned in the woods. "We need to go back and report this," Melanie insisted, her voice tight with fear. "That would take us a day and a half," Josh countered. "And we don't even know what happened here. Maybe the guy just had an equipment failure and hiked out on his own." "Leaving his boot behind?" I asked skeptically. "Look," Darren said, "we should at least check the registration log at the next ranger station. It's only about 5 miles ahead, and we can decide what to do from there." We agreed on this compromise, but the discovery had cast a pall over our expedition. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Several times I spun around, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, but saw nothing. About 2 miles from the destroyed campsite, Josh stopped abruptly. "Tracks," he said, pointing to the ground. The path here was muddy from a recent rainfall, and clear impressions were visible in the soft earth. They weren't human footprints, nor did they match any animal I recognized. The tracks were large, about the size of a human hand, with unusual elongated toes and what looked like claw marks at the tips. "What the hell made these?" Melanie asked, crouching down. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some kind of predator, but nothing native to these mountains that I'm aware of." "They're following the trail," Darren observed. "Same direction we're heading." "Could be a wolf with an injured paw," Josh suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The tracks continued for nearly a quarter mile before disappearing where the trail became rocky. We proceeded with heightened caution, frequently checking behind us and keeping closer together than before. By late afternoon, we reached the small ranger station marked on our map, a simple log cabin used primarily during fire season. As expected in October, it was unmanned and locked. A logbook protected in a plastic case was mounted beside the door for hikers to register their presence in the backcountry. Darren flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. Last sign-in was 10 days ago. Party of 2, names are Miller and Petrosky. Planned a 7-day loop through this area. "That could be whose tent we found," I said. "They never signed out?" Darren noted grimly. We debated our options as the sun began to sink toward the mountain peaks. Turning back would mean at least another day of hiking, and darkness was approaching rapidly. The alpine lake where we'd planned to camp was less than 2 miles ahead. "Let's stick to the plan," I decided finally. "We'll reach the lake before dark, make camp, and head back first thing tomorrow." No one was enthusiastic about continuing forward, but the alternative, being caught on the trail after nightfall, seemed worse. We moved at a brisk pace, eager to reach our destination before losing daylight completely. The lake appeared just as the sun touched the horizon, a small, pristine body of water nestled in a natural bowl formed by surrounding ridges. In different circumstances, it would have been idyllic. Now, with the knowledge of the destroyed campsite and strange tracks, it felt exposed and vulnerable. We set up camp with military efficiency, positioning our tents close together and gathering extra firewood. No one spoke about what we'd found, but it hung in the air between us. An unacknowledged presence as tangible as the approaching darkness. That night, as we sat around the fire, Melanie broke the uneasy silence. "I keep feeling like we're being watched." None of us contradicted her. I'd felt the same sensation all afternoon, eyes following our movements, calculating, waiting. The feeling was so intense I could almost point to where the observer was hiding. "We should set up a perimeter," I suggested. "Something that will make noise if anything approaches." Using fishing line from Josh's emergency kit, we strung an alarm system around our campsite, cans and metal cooking equipment that would rattle if the line was disturbed. It wasn't much, but it provided some small comfort as we retired to our tents. Sleep was elusive that night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified: the rustle of pine needles, the soft lapping of water against the lakeshore, the occasional distant cry of a nightbird. I lay awake, listening, waiting, my hand resting on the handle of my hunting knife. Just before midnight, our alarm system erupted in a cacophony of metallic clanging. I bolted upright in my tent, fumbling for my flashlight. Outside, the alarm continued to sound, a chaotic jangling of displaced cookware. Darren was already shouting, his voice tight with fear. "Who's there? We're armed!" A bluff, but perhaps a necessary one. Between us, we had only hunting knives and a small hatchet for splitting firewood. I unzipped my tent with one hand, knife clutched in the other, and emerged into the moonlit clearing. The perimeter line on the western edge of our camp had been triggered. Metal cups and plates lay scattered on the ground, but there was no sign of what had disturbed them. The others joined me, forming a tight cluster, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "Did anyone see anything?" I asked. "Movement by those trees," Josh said, pointing toward a dense stand of pines about 30 yards away. "Just for a second." We swept our lights across the area, but illuminated nothing except foliage and shadows. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet again, the same eerie silence we'd experienced the previous night. "Let's build up the fire," I suggested. The idea of light and warmth seemed comforting, even if it was mostly psychological. As we gathered around the rekindled flames, Melanie gripped Josh's arm suddenly. "Listen," she whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then it came, a sound so incongruous it took several seconds to process. Someone or something was whistling, a simple three-note pattern repeated at irregular intervals. The sound seemed to move, circling our campsite just beyond the reach of our firelight. "Hello?" Darren called out. "Is someone there? We're friendly hikers." The whistling stopped immediately. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the crackling of our fire. Then came a response, not words, but a perfect mimicry of Darren's voice repeating his exact inflection. "Hello? Is someone there? We're friendly hikers." The imitation was so precise it seemed impossible, like hearing a recording played back. Goosebumps erupted across my arms. "What the hell?" Josh muttered. The voice came again, this time mimicking Josh. "What the hell?" "It's playing with us," I said quietly. As if in confirmation, my own words echoed back from the darkness. "It's playing with us." We stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this bizarre encounter. The mimic fell silent for several minutes, long enough that we began to wonder if it had departed. Then a new sound emerged from the forest. Not mimicry this time, but a low, rhythmic clicking noise like stones being struck together. "We need to leave," Melanie said, her voice barely audible. "First light, we pack up and go." None of us argued with this plan. The clicking continued throughout the night, sometimes moving closer, sometimes receding, but never completely disappearing. We maintained a vigil in shifts, keeping the fire burning high, no one managing more than brief, fitful sleep. The pre-dawn light brought no relief. A dense fog had settled over the lake, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. The clicking had stopped, but the sense of being observed remained palpable. We packed quickly, leaving behind non-essential items to speed our departure. The plan was simple: retrace our steps to the ranger station, then follow the main trail back to the trailhead. If we pushed hard, we could make it out before nightfall. The fog complicated our journey. Landmarks visible just yesterday had vanished in the murky grayness, forcing us to rely on compass readings and trail markers. We moved as quickly as safety allowed, no one speaking except to confirm directions or warn of obstacles. About a mile from camp, Melanie stopped abruptly. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the ground. The trail here was soft, and clear impressions were visible in the dirt, the same unusual tracks we'd seen the day before, but now they were everywhere, crisscrossing the path as if whatever made them had been pacing back and forth. The tracks were fresh, the edges still crisp. "It was here during the night," I said, watching us. "Let's keep moving," Darren urged, glancing nervously at the surrounding forest, now ghostly and indistinct in the fog. We quickened our pace, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fear. The strange tracks followed the trail for nearly half a mile before veering off into the underbrush. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain that our stalker was keeping pace just out of sight. The fog began to thin as the morning progressed, but our sense of unease only intensified. The forest seemed different somehow, the familiar sounds absent or altered, the spacing of trees not quite as I remembered. Several times Josh consulted the map with growing confusion. "This doesn't look right," he said finally, stopping at a fork in the trail not marked on our map. "We should have reached the ranger station by now." "We must have taken a wrong turn," Darren suggested, though we'd been following the main trail consistently. "Or the fog disoriented us," I added, trying to make sense of our surroundings. We decided to take the right fork, which seemed to angle back toward where we believed the ranger station should be. The path narrowed quickly, becoming less maintained, with branches reaching across the trail and roots creating treacherous obstacles. After another hour of increasingly difficult hiking, the trail disappeared entirely, leaving us standing in a small clearing surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. The realization hit us simultaneously. We were lost. "This is impossible," Josh said, frustration evident in his voice. "We followed the main trail. There's no way we should be this disoriented." "Let's check the compass again," I suggested, trying to remain calm. Darren pulled out his compass and frowned. "This can't be right. According to this, we've been heading northeast, but we should have been going southwest toward the trailhead." "Let me see," I said, taking the compass. The needle spun lazily, never settling on any particular direction. "It's malfunctioning." "Mine too," Melanie said, checking her own compass. "How is that possible?" "Natural magnetic deposits in the area, maybe," Josh suggested, but he sounded doubtful. We had no choice but to use the sun for orientation, but even this proved challenging with the lingering fog and the dense forest canopy obscuring clear sight lines. We selected what seemed to be the most promising direction and began hiking, marking trees as we passed to avoid going in circles. The day wore on and our progress seemed painfully slow. The terrain became increasingly difficult. Steep inclines, rocky outcroppings, dense underbrush that snagged at our clothing and equipment. By mid-afternoon, we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. "We need to stop and regroup," I said finally. "We're burning energy and not making meaningful progress." We found a small clearing and dropped our packs, grateful for the respite. As we shared water and trail mix, I noticed Melanie staring intently into the forest. "Do you hear that?" she asked. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then it registered. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from deeper in the woods, the same clicking we'd heard during the night. "It's still following us," Josh muttered. "Maybe it's trying to communicate," Darren suggested, though his expression betrayed his doubt. "Or it's hunting us," I said quietly. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, coming from multiple directions now. It was as if we were surrounded, the sound closing in from all sides. We gathered our gear quickly, abandoning the rest break. "Stay together," I urged as we moved off, choosing the direction with the least audible clicking. The sounds followed us throughout the afternoon, sometimes receding, sometimes approaching so close I was certain we'd come face to face with whatever was making them. The forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead, promising rain and an early dusk. With daylight fading and no sign of the trail, we were forced to make camp in another small clearing. Unlike our previous sites, this one offered little natural protection. No lake or rock formations to guard our backs, just trees in every direction. As we set up our tents with grim efficiency, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were exactly where something wanted us to be. The rain started just after sunset, a gentle patter at first, quickly intensifying to a steady downpour that drummed against our tent flies and saturated the ground. We huddled beneath our inadequate shelter, the planned campfire impossible in the deluge. Our headlamps created small islands of light in the overwhelming darkness. The temperature dropped rapidly, and soon we were shivering despite our layers of clothing. The clicking sounds had stopped when the rain began, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. "We can't stay out here another night," Melanie said, her voice barely audible over the rainfall. "We need to find our way back to civilization tomorrow, no matter what." "Agreed," I said. "First light, we pick a direction and stick with it. Eventually we'll hit a road or a town." "We should be taking shifts keeping watch," Josh suggested. Darren nodded. "I'll take first watch." We established a rotation, 2 hours per person, using our watches to track time. I was scheduled for the final shift just before dawn. Exhausted from the day's arduous hiking, I fell into a restless sleep almost immediately, my dreams filled with shadowy pursuers and endless forests. When Josh woke me from my watch, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The forest was draped in fog again, limiting visibility to just a few yards beyond our campsite. I positioned myself at the edge of our cluster of tents, straining to see or hear anything unusual in the pre-dawn gloom. For the first hour, the forest remained quiet except for the occasional drip of water from saturated branches. Then, just as the eastern sky began to lighten imperceptibly, I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustling approaching from my left. I switched on my headlamp, directing the beam toward the sound. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of movement, something low to the ground, moving with unnatural speed between the trees. Then it was gone. I stood up, scanning the perimeter of our camp. The fog seemed to shift and swirl, creating illusions of movement everywhere I looked. A branch snapped behind me and I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, not just observed, but studied, evaluated. I considered waking the others but hesitated. What would I tell them? That I'd seen a shadow? That I felt eyes on me? The decision was made for me when a blood-curdling scream tore through the forest. Not animal, not human, but something in between. The others bolted from their tents, disoriented and alarmed. "What was that?" Darren demanded, fumbling with his headlamp. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's close." We formed a tight circle, backs together, scanning the surrounding fog. For several minutes nothing happened. Then the scream came again, closer this time, followed by the now familiar clicking sound, rapid and excited. "There!" Josh shouted, pointing. Through a gap in the fog, about 30 yards away, stood a figure. In the poor visibility and strange light, details were difficult to discern, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed oddly jointed. It remained motionless, just watching us. "Hello?" Darren called out, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" The figure tilted its head, an unsettlingly bird-like motion, but didn't respond or move closer. "We're lost hikers," I added, trying to sound calm. "We don't mean any harm." For a long moment the standoff continued. 4 terrified hikers and the silent, unmoving watcher. Then, without warning, it dropped to all fours and vanished into the fog with startling speed. "What the hell was that?" Josh whispered, his face pale in the beam of my headlamp. "A person," Melanie insisted. "It had to be a person." "That wasn't human," Darren countered. "Did you see how it moved?" "It doesn't matter what it was," I interrupted. "We need to leave. Now." Despite the early hour and limited visibility, we packed up immediately, abandoning any equipment that would slow us down. Our priority was distance, putting as much space as possible between ourselves and whatever was stalking us. We chose a direction based solely on the rising sun and started hiking, pushing through wet underbrush and slippery terrain. No one spoke. We saved our breath for movement, for escape. About an hour into our frantic journey, Melanie stopped suddenly. "Listen," she said. We paused, hearing what had caught her attention. The distant sound of running water, much larger than a stream. A river. "Rivers lead to civilization," I said, hope flaring for the first time in days. If we follow it downstream, we'll eventually reach a road or a town. We altered course toward the sound, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The terrain grew steeper as we descended toward the river valley, forcing us to use trees and rocks for support. The fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of our surroundings, unfamiliar territory, but at least we could see more than a few yards ahead. When we finally reached the river, it was larger than expected, about 30 feet across with a strong current. The banks were rocky and steep, making travel alongside it challenging but not impossible. Downstream, I confirmed, pointing to our right. That should eventually lead us out of the wilderness. We had covered perhaps half a mile along the riverbank when Darren, who was leading, stopped abruptly. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the ground. Pressed into a patch of mud were several distinct footprints, human footprints, from hiking boots. They were recent, the edges still sharp despite the rain. "Other hikers?" Melanie asked hopefully. I examined the tracks more closely and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp weather. "These are our own boot prints," I said quietly, "from our original hike-in." "That's impossible," Josh protested. "We're nowhere near our original trail." But there was no denying the evidence. Somehow, despite hiking in what we thought was a completely different direction, we had circled back to a point on our inbound journey. "We've been going in circles," Darren said, his voice hollow. "This whole time." The realization was devastating. Despite our best efforts, we had made no progress toward safety. Something was interfering with our navigation, keeping us trapped in this section of wilderness. "It's playing with us," Melanie whispered, echoing my words from the previous night. As if in response, the clicking sound started again, still distant but clearly audible over the rush of the river. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, surrounding us. "We follow the river," I decided firmly. "It has to lead somewhere, and it's our best chance of breaking whatever pattern we've been caught in." No one argued. We resumed our journey downstream, moving with renewed determination. The terrain alongside the river was treacherous. Slippery rocks, steep embankments, fallen trees creating obstacles. Several times one of us nearly fell into the swift current. The clicking followed us, sometimes fading, sometimes intensifying, but never disappearing completely. We began to notice other signs of pursuit as well. Branches moving against the wind, glimpses of something dark flitting between trees on the opposite bank, occasional screams that seemed to answer the clicking sounds. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion was taking its toll. We were all stumbling more frequently, reactions slowed by fatigue and stress. We needed to rest, but stopping felt dangerous, as if movement was our only protection. "We can't keep this pace," Josh said finally, breathing heavily after a particularly steep section. "We need to eat and rehydrate or we'll make mistakes." Reluctantly, we agreed to a brief stop. Finding a relatively flat area beside the river, we collapsed onto the rocky ground, muscles aching. I distributed the remaining trail mix and energy bars, rationing carefully. Our food supplies were dwindling faster than planned. As we ate in silence, I noticed Darren staring intently across the river. "What is it?" I asked. "There's something on the other side," he said quietly. "In those trees." I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught my eye, a dark shape shifting position behind a large pine. It was difficult to discern details at this distance, but its proportions seemed similar to the figure we'd glimpsed at dawn, unnaturally tall and thin. "It's watching us again," I confirmed, keeping my voice low. "I'm getting a picture," Josh said, slowly reaching for his phone. "Don't," Melanie hissed. "It might provoke it." "We need evidence of what's happening," Josh insisted. "No one will believe us otherwise." Before anyone could stop him, he raised his phone and snapped several photos of the area across the river. The clicking sound immediately intensified, becoming angry, agitated. The figure stepped out from behind the tree. Even at this distance, there was something profoundly wrong about its appearance. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs too long and oddly articulated. Its skin, if it was skin, appeared dark and textured, blending with the forest behind it. The head was the worst part, elongated and angular, with features I couldn't quite process, as if my mind refused to register what my eyes were seeing. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at us. "Run," I whispered. We abandoned our gear, scrambling to our feet and bolting downstream. Behind us, the creature unleashed another of those terrible screams, now clearly identifiable as a hunting cry. The sound was answered by more clicking, coming from the forest on our side of the river. "They're on both sides," Darren shouted as we ran. The realization hit me with horrible clarity. We weren't being stalked by a single entity, but by multiple creatures, working in coordination to hurt us exactly where they wanted us to go. As we fled downstream, I caught glimpses of movement paralleling our course on both sides of the river, dark figures flitting between trees, always keeping pace, never falling behind despite our desperate speed. We were being hunted, and our hunters were playing with us. The chase continued until dusk, the creatures herding us downstream with calculated precision. Whenever we tried to veer away from the river, the clicking intensified, and dark shapes would appear ahead, forcing us back toward the water. By the time darkness fell, we were beyond exhaustion, muscles burning, lungs heaving, minds clouded with fatigue and terror. We had no choice but to stop, our bodies simply incapable of further flight. "We need shelter," I gasped, scanning our surroundings in the failing light. About 50 yards from the river, a rocky outcropping created a shallow overhang, not a cave, but better than completely exposed ground. We staggered toward it, collapsing beneath its meager protection. "What do they want?" Melanie whispered, her voice raw. No one answered. We had no water, no food, having abandoned our packs during our panicked flight. All that remained were the clothes on our backs and whatever was in our pockets. Josh's phone, now dead, my hunting knife, a lighter, a small first aid kit Darren had been carrying. The temperature dropped rapidly with nightfall. Huddled together for warmth, we took stock of our situation. "They could have caught us if they wanted to," Darren observed. "They're faster. They know the terrain better." "They're toying with us," Josh said bitterly. "Or hurting us," I suggested. "Notice how they keep pushing us downstream? They want us somewhere specific." This realization did nothing to comfort us. What destination could these creatures have in mind, and what would happen when we reached it? As full darkness enveloped the forest, the clicking sounds changed pattern, slower, more deliberate, like a language we couldn't comprehend. The sounds came from multiple directions, suggesting at least 3 or 4 creatures surrounding our position. "We need a fire," I decided, gathering what dry material I could find beneath the overhang. Using Darren's lighter, we managed to start a small blaze. The flames provided minimal warmth, but considerable psychological comfort. The clicking sounds retreated slightly at the appearance of fire, suggesting the creatures had at least some aversion to light. We maintained a watch rotation through the night, though sleep was nearly impossible given our circumstances. During my shift, I noticed a pattern in the creatures' movements. They would approach to a certain distance, retreat, circle, approach again, like they were testing boundaries. Once I caught a clear glimpse of one as it moved from one tree to another about 20 yards from our shelter. The firelight illuminated it briefly, the impossibly elongated limbs, the dark textured skin, the angular head. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its awkward proportions, more like an insect than a mammal. When dawn finally broke, we were still alive, but in deteriorating condition. Dehydration had set in, making our thinking sluggish and our movements uncoordinated. We needed water, which meant approaching the river, exactly where the creatures seemed to want us. "We don't have a choice," I said, when Josh questioned the wisdom of leaving our shelter. "We'll die of thirst otherwise." With extreme caution, we made our way back to the river. The clicking had stopped with daylight, and we saw no sign of our pursuers, though the sense of being watched remained. At the riverbank, we drank deeply despite concerns about water quality. The cold liquid revived us somewhat, clearing our minds enough to formulate a rudimentary plan. "The river has to lead somewhere," I reasoned. "Civilization, or at least a road. We keep following it downstream, but we stay vigilant. They seem less active during daylight." "And if they come for us again?" Melanie asked. I pulled out my hunting knife. "We fight if we have to." It was a hollow assertion. What could a single knife do against multiple creatures that moved with such speed and coordination? But having any plan, however desperate, was better than the paralysis of complete hopelessness. We followed the river throughout the morning, our pace slower now due to fatigue and injury. Josh had twisted his ankle during yesterday's flight, and Melanie's hands were bleeding from falls onto rocky terrain. Darren had developed a hacking cough that grew worse with exertion. The river valley gradually widened as we progressed, the current slowing and the water deepening. By midday, we estimated we'd covered perhaps 5 miles from our night shelter. The terrain was changing subtly, more deciduous trees mixed with the conifers, suggesting a lower elevation. "Look," Darren said suddenly, pointing ahead. "A bridge." About half a mile downstream, a wooden structure spanned the river, clearly man-made, though crude and weathered. The sight of it sparked renewed energy, and we quickened our pace despite our exhaustion. As we approached, the bridge revealed itself to be old but solid. Constructed from rough-hewn logs with a simple plank walkway, it appeared to connect to trails on both sides of the river. "This has to lead somewhere," Josh said, hope evident in his voice for the first time in days. We stepped onto the bridge cautiously, testing its strength. The wooden planks creaked but held firm. Midway across, I stopped to examine markings carved into one of the support posts. Symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning. "Some kind of trail markers?" Darren suggested, studying the carvings. "I don't think so," I replied uneasily. "These don't look like anything official." We continued across and found ourselves at a junction of crude trails. One path followed the river downstream, while another headed directly into the forest, away from the water. "Which way?" Melanie asked. Before anyone could answer, the clicking started again, but different this time, more urgent, almost angry. It came from directly ahead, blocking the river path. "They don't want us going that way," I observed. "All the more reason to choose it," Josh argued. "Or it's a trap," Darren countered. "Maybe they're trying to make us think we should avoid that direction." The psychological games were wearing us down. Every decision felt potentially fatal, with unseen watchers analyzing our choices, staying one step ahead. In the end, we chose the forest path, reasoning that the clicking warnings felt too obvious a manipulation. The trail was more defined than expected, suggesting regular use, though by what or whom was unclear. As we moved deeper into the forest, the canopy thickened overhead, creating a perpetual twilight despite the midday hour. The clicking followed at a distance, sometimes fading completely before resuming from a different direction. After about 2 miles of steady hiking, the trail opened into a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, small, weathered, but undeniably human-built. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating occupation. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, suddenly cautious. After days of wilderness and inhuman pursuers, the sight of a habitation should have been welcome. Instead, it filled me with inexplicable dread. "Something's wrong," I whispered. "It's shelter," Josh countered. "Maybe whoever lives there can help us." "They live out here," Darren said slowly. "In the territory of those things. How is that possible?" Before we could debate further, the cabin door swung open. An elderly man emerged, dressed in worn outdoor clothing. He appeared entirely ordinary, white-bearded, slightly stooped with age, face weathered from exposure. He looked directly at us, showing no surprise at finding 4 bedraggled hikers at the edge of his clearing. "Been expecting you," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the open space. "Come on in before dark falls. Not safe out there after sunset." We exchanged glances, torn between suspicion and desperate need for shelter and assistance. "How did you know we were coming?" I called back. The old man smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "The woods have a way of sending people my direction when they need help. Come in. I've got food and water, and you look like you could use both." Against my better judgment, we approached the cabin. As we crossed the clearing, I noticed small bundles hanging from the surrounding trees. Collections of bones, feathers, and unidentifiable objects tied with sinew and twine. The old man saw me looking. "Protection," he said simply. "Been out here 40 years. You learn ways to stay safe." Inside, the cabin was a single room with sparse furnishings, a wood stove, a rough table with chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, shelves lined with jars and books. Animal pelts hung from the walls, alongside tools and weapons. "Sit," the man instructed, gesturing to the table. "Name's Hansen. Used to be Forest Service back when they staffed the stations year-round. Decided to stay on when they pulled out." He ladled stew from a pot on the stove into wooden bowls, placing them before us with chunks of hard bread. Despite my misgivings, the smell was irresistible after days of inadequate nutrition. As we ate, Hansen asked no questions about our journey or what we'd encountered. Instead, he spoke of the forest, of weather patterns and animal migrations, of the changing seasons and the isolation of wilderness living. Only when we'd finished eating did he address what had brought us to his cabin. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked, his tone matter-of-fact. "The Watchers." We exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. "It's all right," he continued. "Everyone who finds my cabin has seen them. That's how it works." "What are they?" Josh asked, breaking our silence. Hansen shrugged. "Got different names in different cultures. Navajo called them skinwalkers. Other tribes have their own terms. Scientists who come through looking for them never find anything, of course. They only show themselves to who they choose." "Why are they hunting us?" Melanie asked, her voice trembling. "Hunting?" Hansen laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "If they were hunting you, you wouldn't be sitting at my table. No, they're testing you. Like they tested me 40 years ago." "Testing for what?" I demanded. Hansen's eyes met mine, and for a moment, something flickered behind them. Something ancient and calculating that didn't match his appearance. "Worthiness," he said simply. "The forest has its guardians. They decide who belongs and who doesn't." As darkness fell outside, the clicking sounds resumed, closer now, surrounding the cabin. Hansen seemed unconcerned, adding wood to the stove and lighting oil lamps as night descended. "You'll stay until morning," he said. It wasn't an offer, but a statement of fact. "I'll show you the way out at first light. There's a logging road about 5 miles east. It'll take you back to civilization." Despite our exhaustion, none of us slept soundly that night. We took turns resting on the floor, wrapped in blankets Hansen provided. The clicking continued outside, sometimes approaching the very walls of the cabin, sometimes retreating into the forest. During my watch, I noticed Hansen wasn't sleeping either. He sat by the stove, whittling a piece of wood with practiced movements, occasionally glancing toward the windows. "How do you live out here with them?" I asked quietly, not wanting to wake the others. He considered the question for a moment. "We have an understanding," he replied finally. "I respect their territory. They respect mine. The talismans help." He nodded toward the bone bundles visible through the window, swaying gently in the night breeze. "What do they want?" I pressed. Hansen's hand stilled, the knife resting against the wood. "Balance," he said. "The forest maintains its own equilibrium. Too many outsiders disturb that balance." "The missing hikers," I said. "The destroyed campsite we found. Was that them?" "Sometimes they warn," Hansen replied obliquely. "Sometimes they cull. Depends on the trespass." The conversation left me more unsettled than before. Hansen's casual acceptance of the creature's actions, his talk of culling and trespass, suggested a perspective that had shifted far from normal human morality. I wondered, not for the first time, what exactly we were sharing this cabin with. Morning arrived with a heavy mist shrouding the forest. Hansen was already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of oatmeal and strong coffee. We ate quickly, eager to begin our journey to the promised logging road. "Follow the sun," Hansen instructed as we prepared to leave. "Keep it on your right shoulder until midday, then directly behind you. Don't deviate, no matter what you hear or see." "They'll let us go?" Darren asked skeptically. Hansen's expression was unreadable. "You made it to my cabin. That means something to them. But don't test their patience. Move quickly and directly." Before we departed, he handed me a small bundle similar to those hanging from the trees. "Carry this," he said. "It won't guarantee safe passage, but it helps mark you as acknowledged." The object felt unnaturally heavy for its size, wrapped in leather with feathers and small bones protruding from the binding. I secured it to my belt with reluctance, distrusting Hansen almost as much as the creatures, but unwilling to reject any potential protection. As we set out, Hansen remained on his porch, watching our departure with those strange, evaluating eyes. Something about his gaze made me quicken my pace, eager to put distance between ourselves and the cabin. The forest seemed different that morning, the mist creating ghostly shapes among the trees, familiar sounds muted and distorted. We moved in tight formation, following Hansen's directions, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the fog and canopy. For the first hour, we heard nothing unusual. No clicking, no screams, no signs of pursuit. Gradually, our pace increased, confidence building with each unchallenged step. Maybe we're actually going to make it, Josh said cautiously, breaking the tense silence. Don't jinx it, Melanie muttered. We continued eastward, the terrain gradually descending. The forest composition changed, with more deciduous trees appearing among the conifers, suggesting we were approaching lower elevations. According to Hansen, the logging road should be accessible within a few hours of hiking. Around midday, we paused briefly to rest and reorient. The sun had strengthened, burning through patches of mist, making navigation easier. I checked the bundle Hansen had given me, still secured to my belt, though I couldn't shake the sensation that it had grown warmer, almost pulsing against my hip. As we prepared to resume our journey, Darren froze suddenly. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then it registered. The absence of sound. The forest had gone silent again. That unnatural quiet that had preceded each encounter with the creatures. "Keep moving," I urged, fighting rising panic. Hansen said don't stop, no matter what. We quickened our pace, no longer trying to move quietly. Speed was our priority now, distance our only defense. The silence followed us, creating a bubble of emptiness that moved with our progress. After another mile, the clicking started again, distant at first, then gradually closing. It came from behind us this time, as if following rather than hurting. "Don't look back," I instructed. "Just keep moving forward." The terrain grew steeper, forcing us to scramble over fallen logs and navigate around dense underbrush. Each obstacle slowed our progress, allowing the sounds behind us to draw closer. The clicking accelerated, becoming more agitated. "They're gaining," Josh said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt the bundle at my belt grow hotter, almost burning through the fabric of my pants. Acting on instinct, I pulled it free and held it aloft. The clicking stopped abruptly. "Keep moving," I said, still holding the bundle high. "I think this is working." We continued forward at a steady pace, the bundle seemingly holding our pursuers at bay. For nearly half an hour, we hiked in tense silence, the absence of clicking somehow more unnerving than its presence had been. Then, without warning, a scream tore through the forest, directly ahead of us. We stopped dead, confronted with an impossible choice. Behind us, the clicking had resumed, closing rapidly. Ahead, something waited, announcing its presence with that terrible cry. "They've surrounded us," Melanie whispered. I raised the bundle higher, turning in a slow circle. "We keep going forward," I decided. Hansen said straight east, no matter what. We resumed our advance, moving more cautiously now. The terrain began to level out, and through the trees ahead, I could make out what appeared to be a clearing, wider and more regular than a natural feature. "The logging road," Darren said, hope evident in his voice. As we approached the clearing, the clicking intensified from all directions, no longer just behind us, but surrounding us completely. The bundle in my hand began to vibrate, the feathers and bones trembling as if alive. 50 yards from what was indeed a crude dirt road, a figure stepped out from the trees directly in our path. It was one of them, taller than any human, limbs impossibly elongated, skin textured like bark. Its head was the worst part, vaguely humanoid in shape but with features that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, as if refusing to resolve into anything recognizable. It raised one arm, pointing not at us, but at the bundle I held. Understanding came with sudden clarity. The bundle wasn't protection, it was a marker, a tracker. Hansen hadn't been helping us escape. He'd been ensuring we remained within the creature's reach. I hurled the bundle toward the figure. It caught the object with unnatural speed, those long fingers closing around it precisely. For a moment it stood motionless, examining what I'd thrown. Then it stepped aside, clearing our path to the road. "Run," I said quietly. "Now." We broke into a sprint, covering the remaining distance to the road in seconds. The clicking followed but remained at the tree line, not pursuing across the open ground of the road itself. The road stretched in both directions, crude but definitely man-made, rutted from vehicle traffic. We turned left, moving as quickly as our exhausted bodies allowed, putting distance between ourselves and the forest edge. After about a mile, we heard the distant sound of an engine. A battered pickup truck appeared around a bend, driven by an older man in forestry service clothing. He stopped when he saw us, taking in our disheveled appearance with obvious concern. "You folks lost?" he called through the open window. "Hikers," I explained breathlessly. "We got separated from our group, been lost for days." He nodded, not questioning our story. "Hop in the back, I'm heading to town." As we climbed into the truck bed, I glanced back toward the forest. At the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, stood multiple tall figures, motionless, watching. The old forester followed my gaze but showed no reaction, as if he couldn't see what I was staring at. "Something wrong?" he asked. I turned away. "No, just glad to be found." The truck pulled away, carrying us toward civilization. None of us spoke during the journey, each processing the nightmare we'd escaped. The creatures hadn't followed, perhaps unable or unwilling to leave their territory, or perhaps simply satisfied with the test they'd administered. Hansen's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes they warn, sometimes they cull. We had been warned. Others had been culled. The distinction felt arbitrary, a matter of chance rather than merit. What made us worthy of warning rather than elimination? What criteria had we satisfied by reaching Hansen's cabin? The forester dropped us in a small town about 20 miles from the wilderness boundary. From there, we contacted authorities, reporting our experience as a simple case of hikers becoming lost. We mentioned nothing about the creatures or Hansen's cabin. Who would believe us? In the days and weeks that followed, I researched the area extensively. The Bitterroot National Forest has more missing persons cases per capita than almost any wilderness area in the country. Most are classified as accidents or exposure, the bodies never recovered. Official surveys list no permanent residents in the section where we encountered Hansen. The last staffed ranger station was decommissioned in the 1980s. According to records, all personnel were either reassigned or retired. I wonder often about Hansen, who he is, what bargain he struck with the forest guardians. How many lost hikers he's directed over the years? Was he once like us, tested and found worthy of a different fate? Has he become something other than human during his 40 years in those woods? I don't hike anymore. The others have similarly abandoned outdoor activities. Some nights, I wake to the sound of clicking outside my window. Just branches tapping in the wind, I tell myself, though I never open the curtains to check. The forest tested us. We survived. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still being watched, still being evaluated. That the test isn't over, merely moved to a different venue. Sometimes they warn, sometimes they cull. The distinction, I've come to believe, is less important than the message. The wilderness has guardians, and they are neither benevolent nor malevolent, merely balanced in their own terrifying way. And in the deepest part of night when sleep eludes me, I wonder if they followed us home.